I ain't pretty, Mr. Carter. She stood on that platform with her worn suitcase and her tired eyes and said it like a confession, like she was warning him before he could hurt her first. But I can cook. Nathaniel Carter had built an empire out of Wyoming dirt. He'd outlasted blizzards and bankruptcies, and the kind of grief that breaks most men in half. But standing on that train platform, looking at this plain woman who expected nothing from him, he felt something crack open in his chest, that 6 years of silence had sealed shut. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Margaret's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Wyoming Territory, 1885. Nathaniel Carter had not slept the night before she arrived. That was the part nobody knew. Not his foreman, not his ranch hands, not the men who respected him from Cheyenne to the Montana border. They all believed Nathaniel Carter was a man who moved through life without hesitation, a man who decided and acted and never looked back. But the night before the train came in, he sat at his kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and stared at the letter he'd read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Mr. Carter, I believe you should know something before you decide. I am not the kind of woman men notice when I enter a room. I am not beautiful, but I can cook. I can manage a home. I can work hard. And I know how to care for people. He'd received 17 letters from the marriage agency over the past 8 months. 17 women. Some had described their fine educations. Some had listed their family connections. 2 had sent small portrait photographs arranged with careful attention to lighting and posture. Not one of them had written what Margaret Ellis wrote. Not one of them had started a letter by telling him her flaws. Nathaniel wasn't a sentimental man. He hadn't been sentimental since Eleanor died. Sentiment was a luxury he'd decided he could no longer afford, the way a man in a drought stops watering his flower garden and focuses on keeping the cattle alive. But that letter did something to him. He couldn't name it exactly. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't excitement. It was more like the feeling of recognizing something true after a long time of reading things that were carefully constructed to sound true. The difference between a man who tells you exactly what the weather is doing outside and a man who tells you what you want to hear so you'll like him. He wrote back within 2 days. Come to Wyoming. Let us see what kind of life we can build. That was all. He didn't make promises. He didn't offer romance. He was honest in his own way, the same way she was honest in hers. And now, the night before her train arrived, he was wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Not because of her letter, because of himself. Because Nathaniel Carter was 42 years old and had forgotten how to share a house with another person. His foreman, a leathery, sharp-eyed man named Clyde Harmon, had told him the truth 6 weeks earlier, in the way only a man who has worked beside you for 14 years can tell you truth. You know what your problem is. Nathaniel had been checking feed records. He didn't look up. I have several. Your problem is you've arranged your whole life so nothing can touch you. That made him look up. Clyde leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, unbothered by the look Nathaniel was giving him. You built this ranch back up after Eleanor. You hired good men. You've got accounts that would make a banker weep with happiness. Everything's in order. And that's a problem. Yes, Clyde said simply. Because order isn't living, and this place hasn't been living in 6 years. Nathaniel set down the feed record. You've been talking to someone. I've been watching someone, Clyde said. You. And it's time to stop pretending that keeping everything running is the same as being alive. He'd thought about that conversation every day since. And now he sat in the kitchen at midnight, and he thought about it again. The kitchen had been Eleanor's. That was the honest truth of it. Eleanor had loved that kitchen the way some women love a garden, the way she tended and arranged and transformed ingredients into things that made people feel cared for. After she died, Nathaniel had kept the kitchen clean because he kept everything on his property clean. But he hadn't cooked in it. He'd eaten what his cook prepared sitting alone at a table built for 12, and he'd called that efficiency. Margaret Ellis said she could cook. He didn't know why that had mattered to him so much. Maybe because he missed the smell of bread. Maybe because he missed someone caring enough about a house to make it feel lived in. He didn't know. He sat there until the coffee was entirely cold and the moon had shifted across the kitchen window, and then he got up, washed the cup, and went to get dressed for the train station. The platform at Ridgeline Station was not a large or impressive place. It was a single wooden structure along a track that connected the smaller Wyoming towns to the larger rail lines east and west. On market days it was busy enough. On ordinary days it was quiet. The station master, a man named Horace, was leaning against the wall when Nathaniel arrived and gave him a long, knowing look. "You waiting on someone particular?" "A passenger." Horace nodded slowly. "Heard you were bringing in a woman." Nathaniel looked at him without expression. "Word travels." "In Ridgeline it does." Horace scratched behind his ear. "People are curious." "People can remain curious." Horace smiled and looked away, and Nathaniel took his position at the end of the platform and waited. He'd stood on that platform many times. To receive shipments, to see business contacts arrive from the east once, to meet a government land assessor who turned out to be both less intelligent and more corrupt than advertised. He was comfortable on that platform. He knew how to stand on it. He had no idea what he was supposed to feel in the next few minutes. The train arrived at 10:30 in the morning, iron and steam, and the deep mechanical groan of something enormous slowing itself down. Passengers began to step off. A family with 3 children, a man in a suit carrying a leather portfolio, an older woman moving carefully with a cane, and then a brown coat, a worn suitcase, a woman who stepped onto the platform and stopped the way a person stops when they're trying to find something in a place they've never been, and her eyes moved across the platform with a careful, quiet assessment that reminded Nathaniel of the way he looked at new land, taking in the details, figuring out what you're working with. She was plain. She had said so in her letter, and she had not been exaggerating. She was not the kind of woman who turned heads or caught the eye. Her face was kind and tired, and entirely unornamented. Her coat was clean, but had been mended at least twice along the right sleeve. She was carrying that suitcase herself, and not looking for someone to carry it for her. She found him before he reached her. Their eyes met across the platform. He watched her face change. He'd been in enough negotiations to know what a person looked like when they were bracing for bad news. The slight tension in the jaw, the careful blankness, the way she straightened her spine just slightly, as if preparing for something unpleasant that she intended to endure with dignity. She expected him to be disappointed. She'd come all this way from Iowa expecting to be sent back. That was the thing that hit him, standing there on that platform, and hit him harder than he'd anticipated. Not the look of her, the expectation in her, the way she had already prepared herself to be unwanted. He walked toward her. She held her ground chin, level eyes steady. "Miss Ellis." "Mr. Carter." Her voice was clear and direct, not a whisper, not a performance. Just a woman speaking to a man honestly the way she'd written a letter honestly. "I imagine you're looking me over and reconsidering." "I'm introducing myself," Nathaniel said. Something flickered in her face. "Then I apologize." She shifted the suitcase to her other hand. "I've learned to assume the worst and count it a gift when I'm wrong." "That seems like an exhausting way to live." She looked at him for a long moment. Directly. Not coyly, not with performance, just looking at him, taking his measure the same way he was taking hers. "I suppose it is," she said finally. "But it's kept me from being surprised by disappointment too many times." Nathaniel reached out. "Let me take that." He meant the suitcase. She looked at his hand, looked at the suitcase, and then looked back at his face as if she was deciding whether this was kindness or pity, and whether she could tell the difference right now. She let him take it. They walked to the wagon in silence, and Nathaniel thought, she doesn't talk to fill space. He respected that immediately, and without entirely meaning to. He helped her up to the seat and took the reins, and they had been moving for perhaps 3 minutes when she spoke. "I should tell you something before we arrive." "All right?" "I know what I look like. I know what people think when they look at me and then look at your ranch and try to put those two things together." She was looking straight ahead, watching the road. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not, to make that easier for you. Nathaniel kept his eyes on the road too. I didn't ask you to. No, she agreed. You didn't. But most men, most people, they appreciate it when a woman softens her edges a little, makes things more comfortable. Comfortable isn't something I've set much store by. She turned to look at him then. He could feel it, the weight of her attention. What do you set store by? She asked. He thought about it. He was a man who thought before he spoke, and he didn't see any reason to stop doing that, just because there was a woman beside him waiting for the answer. Honesty, he said finally. Work. A person who does what they say and says what they mean. The corner of her mouth moved. Almost a smile. Not quite. Then we may get along better than either of us expected. They arrived at Carter Ranch at midday. Clyde Harmon was waiting in the yard, not conspicuously, but waiting. He was checking a fence line along the front of the property, which was work that could have been done by any of 12 men who worked for him, and which he had chosen to do personally this morning, and Nathaniel knew exactly what that meant, and chose not to comment on it. When the wagon pulled in, Clyde straightened up. Margaret climbed down before Nathaniel could assist her, and she stood in the yard and she looked at the house. It was a large house. Anyone could see that. 2 stories, solid construction, 6 years of care and investment visible in every beam and shutter. The kind of house that said, this man has built something and means to keep it standing. But Margaret wasn't looking at the grandness of it. Nathaniel watched her face. She was looking at the windows. One of them on the ground floor had a shutter hinge that had rusted and tilted the shutter at a slight angle. She noticed it immediately. She looked at the porch. 3 of the boards needed replacing, which he had known for 2 seasons, but considered low priority. She looked at the flower beds along the front that had been cleared of weeds but were otherwise empty, the way a face is clean, but without any expression. She wasn't cataloging the wealth. She was seeing the neglect. Not cruel neglect. Not careless neglect. The neglect of a man who kept everything functional and couldn't remember when functional stopped being enough. It's a fine house, she said. It's a house, Nathaniel said. I'm hoping you'll make it a home. She looked at him sideways. He hadn't meant for that to come out quite so directly, and he suspected his face showed it because the almost smile appeared on her face again. Give me a few weeks, she said quietly. Clyde cleared his throat. Ma'am. He stepped forward and took off his hat. Clyde Harmon, foreman. Miss Ellis, she said, and shook his hand with the firm grip of someone who had worked with their hands for a very long time. How many men on the ranch? Clyde blinked. He'd clearly expected a different opening question. 23 currently. 6 full-time in the house operation, the rest in the fields and cattle work. And where does everyone eat? There's a kitchen building off the main house. Cook comes in 3 times a week. 3 times a week. Men make do otherwise. Margaret set her suitcase down in the dirt of the yard. Starting tomorrow, she said, everyone eats properly. Clyde looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. I'll need to see what's in the kitchen this afternoon, Margaret continued. And I'll need someone to take me to the market in town by the end of the week. She picked her suitcase back up. Can you show me where I'll be staying? Clyde, who was not a man easily flustered, looked mildly flustered. He led her inside. Nathaniel stood in the yard alone for a moment. He didn't know what he'd expected. Something tentative, maybe. A woman moving carefully through a new place, afraid to take up too much space. Margaret Ellis had walked into his ranch and within 10 minutes had announced a change to the meal schedule. He found himself almost smiling. He couldn't remember the last time he'd almost smiled. The first evening was uncomfortable the way most first evenings are uncomfortable. They sat at the long dining table, the table built for 12 that usually held only 1, and Nathaniel could feel the size of the room around them, all that empty space, and all the silence that lived in it. Margaret had found bread in the kitchen and made soup from the provisions available. Nothing elaborate, but it was hot and seasoned properly, and it tasted like food made by someone who understood that food was supposed to make people feel better. He hadn't tasted that in a long time. "This is good," he said. "It's what was available." She broke a piece of bread without looking up. "Tomorrow will be better." "I wasn't complaining." "I know you weren't. I was informing you." He looked at her. She kept her eyes on her bowl, and he had the distinct impression that she was slightly amused by the look she knew he was giving her. "Do you always do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Say exactly what you mean." She looked up. "Is there another way? Most people coat things a little, make them go down easier." "I've found that usually helps the person saying the thing more than the person hearing it," Margaret said. "The coating, I mean. It makes the speaker feel kinder without actually being kinder." She took a sip of water. "I'd rather just say what's true." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "My wife was like that," he said. He hadn't meant to say that. He heard himself say it and recognized that it was exactly the kind of thing he didn't say, the kind of territory he'd kept locked and fenced for 6 years. But it had come out, and he couldn't take it back, and he sat with it. Margaret didn't push, didn't lean forward with sympathy, didn't perform compassion. She just said, "She sounds like she was a good person." She was. A pause. "I'm sorry you lost her." "Thank you," Nathaniel said, and somehow that was enough. No more was needed. Margaret went back to her soup, and Nathaniel went back to his, and the silence that came after wasn't the heavy silence of avoidance, but something closer to the comfortable silence of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with performance. He noticed it. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. The trouble started the next morning. Not disaster, not yet, but the first tremors of it. The first sign that Margaret Ellis's arrival at Carter Ranch was not going to pass without the kind of attention that other people's choices always attracted in a small community. He found out at breakfast. He came downstairs to find that Margaret had been up since before 5 o'clock. The kitchen, his kitchen, Eleanor's kitchen. The room that had been functional and sterile and empty of everything but basic utility for 6 years, was warm. Not just from the stove. Warm the way a room is warm when someone has put care into it. The coffee was strong and hot, and there were biscuits on the table, and the smell of something cooking that reminded him so sharply of mornings with Eleanor that he stopped in the doorway and had to take a breath before he could step inside. 3 of his ranch hands were already at the table, not the kitchen table. The kitchen table was not where ranch hands had ever eaten before, because the kitchen table was in the house, not in the separate eating area where the cook left food 3 times a week. But here were 3 of his men, Daniel and Marcus, and a new hire named Pete, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee cups. And Margaret was moving between the stove and the counter with the settled efficiency of a woman entirely at home in a kitchen. "Morning," she said to Nathaniel without looking up from the eggs she was turning. "Coffee's on the counter. Biscuits are done. I'm finishing eggs for the early crew, and then I'll start the main breakfast." Daniel looked up at Nathaniel with the cautious expression of a man who wasn't sure whether he was in trouble. "She invited us in," he said. "I can see that," Nathaniel said. Is that all right?" Nathaniel looked at Margaret, who had still not looked up from the stove. "Mr. Carter," she said, answering the question he hadn't asked yet. "Your men have been eating cold provisions and whatever they can scrape together on the days the cook doesn't come. Daniel here has a shoulder that needs rest, and he's been hauling feed because he can't ask for a lighter assignment without feeling like he's letting everyone down. Marcus's coffee every morning has been something he makes himself at 4 in the morning over a camp stove because he gets up early and doesn't want to wait. And Pete is 19 years old and has been here 6 weeks, and nobody has told him yet where the flour is kept in the supply building." She set the eggs on a plate and put it in front of Marcus. "I know their names," she continued, still without drama, still with the same quiet directness that Nathaniel was already recognizing as simply the way she was, "because I asked them. Is it all right?" Nathaniel looked at Daniel, who was very carefully not making eye contact with him. He looked at Pete, who was 19, and looked like someone had told him Christmas came early. He looked at Marcus, who was already halfway through his eggs. "It's all right," Nathaniel said. He poured his own coffee and sat down. Margaret put biscuits in front of him. "You need to tell Daniel to take 2 days off that shoulder," she said. "He doesn't take orders from me about his health." "He would if they came from you." Nathaniel looked at Daniel, who was now deeply interested in his biscuit. "Daniel," Nathaniel said, "I'm fine. You're going to rest that shoulder for 2 days, or I'm going to find work for you that involves sitting down, which you will hate significantly more." Daniel's jaw set. "I don't need 2 days," Nathaniel said. "I'm not asking." Daniel looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at her stove. "Don't look at her," Nathaniel said. "Look at me." "Yes, sir," Daniel muttered. Margaret, still facing the stove, allowed herself a small smile that no one but Nathaniel was positioned to see. He noticed. He looked back at his coffee. By the end of the first week, the kitchen had become something Nathaniel didn't have a word for. It had become the center. Ranch hands, who had been strangers to each other's names, were sitting together at meals. Arguments that had been simmering between men, the particular low-grade friction that built up when people worked closely in difficult conditions and had nowhere to release it, were coming up in conversation and getting resolved. Sometimes sharply, sometimes with laughter, but getting resolved instead of festering. Nathaniel watched this happen and couldn't quite trace the mechanism. He finally asked Clyde. They were checking cattle in the east pasture, and Nathaniel said, "What's happening in the bunkhouse?" Clyde looked at him. "In what sense?" The men seemed different. Clyde was quiet for a moment, looking at the cattle. "You know what was wrong before? Before she came. Tell me." "The men didn't have anywhere that felt like belonging. They worked for you, they respected you, but you don't." He paused, choosing words carefully. "You don't make people feel like they're part of something. You make them feel like they're doing a job. She makes them feel like they're part of something." Nathaniel turned that over. "There's a difference," Clyde added. "I can see there is. She knows their names inside 2 days. She knows Daniel's shoulder. She knows Marcus gets up at 4. She knows Pete's never been away from home before." Clyde shook his head slowly. "Nathaniel, nobody's noticed those men in years. Maybe ever." Nathaniel didn't say anything. "That's what happened," Clyde said. "In case you were wondering." That night, Nathaniel sat in the kitchen after supper, and he watched Margaret clearing up, and he thought about what Clyde had said, and he thought about how 6 years could pass, and a man could run an operation this size, and never once think about whether his people felt like they belonged to it. "Margaret." She turned from the counter. "The men," he said. "They like you. They're good men." She turned back to the dishes. "They just needed someone to notice that. I should have noticed." She didn't answer right away. She finished the cup she was washing, set it carefully, and then she turned to face him. "You were keeping things running," she said. "That matters. It's not the same as everything, but it matters. The men know that too." "That's generous of you." "It's accurate," she said. "There's a difference." And that was the thing about Margaret Ellis. Nathaniel was beginning to understand. She didn't comfort with softness. She comforted with precision. She told you what was actually true, and what was actually true was almost always more bearable than what your worst thoughts were telling you. He thought about that for a long time after she'd gone to bed. He thought, "I married a stranger 8 weeks ago, and I don't feel like I'm living with a stranger." He thought, "That's either very good or very dangerous, and I'm not sure I can tell the difference tonight." He blew out the lamp and went upstairs to his room, and for the first time in 6 years, he fell asleep thinking about something other than the ranch. The letter came on a Friday. He almost missed its significance. It came with a stack of correspondence accounts payable, a letter from his cattle broker in Cheyenne, an update from the bank. He opened the bank letter last, and he read it twice, and then he sat very still at his desk for a long moment. The bank was calling in a portion of his operating loan. Not all of it, not immediately, but the cattle broker's market report had been bad, and the bank was nervous and they wanted partial repayment within 90 days. 90 days. He ran the numbers in his head. He knew them without looking at the books. Knew them the way he knew the weight of a fence post or the distance from the north pasture to the creek. The numbers were not good. Not catastrophic, he'd survived worse, but not good. He would need to sell cattle at below market rates or find another source of capital quickly, and neither of those options was simple. He put the letter in his drawer. He didn't tell anyone. That was his habit. Absorb the problem. Assess the problem. Solve the problem, quietly and alone. Never let anyone see the weight of a difficulty until it was already behind you. He was very good at it. He was also, as he was beginning to suspect, very tired of it. That evening Margaret brought his supper to the study. Because she had noticed he didn't know how she'd noticed, he hadn't said anything that he had not come to the table. She set the tray on his desk without being asked, and then stood reading his face the way a woman reads weather. "What's happened?" she said. "Nothing that needs discussion tonight." "All right." She didn't move toward the door. "Is it something I should know about?" He looked at her. She stood there with the same quality she always had, not pushing, not performing. Concern, just present. Just available. Just asking directly what most people would spend an hour dancing around. He pulled the letter out of the drawer and handed it to her. She read it. Her expression didn't change dramatically. Not panic, not despair. But he could see her processing it, could see the careful intelligence behind her eyes working through the implications. "How long have you known the cattle market was softening?" she asked. "A few months." "And you were managing it?" "I was managing it." She handed the letter back. "You'll manage this too." "Most likely. But it would be easier with two people thinking about it." He looked at her. "I know I'm not a businesswoman," Margaret said. "I know I don't understand cattle markets and bank loans the way you do. But I know how to think through a problem, and I know this place as well as you do now, and—" She stopped, steadied something in herself. "I'm your wife, Nathaniel. That means I'm your partner, if you'll let me be." The word partner. He hadn't thought of a marriage in those terms in a very long time. He'd thought of companionship, of household management, of two people coexisting with a reasonable degree of respect. But partnership, that was a different word. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. And Margaret Ellis sat down across the desk from the richest rancher in the county and began to talk. She didn't have immediate answers. She was honest about that. She didn't pretend to understand cattle futures or land valuations or the particular rhythms of Wyoming beef markets. But she asked questions. She asked smart questions, the kind of questions that came from someone who understood systems, even if not this specific system. And through her questions, she made him think through things more carefully than he'd been thinking when he was alone with the problem. By the end of an hour, he had a clearer picture of his options than he'd had at the beginning of the evening. Not a solution. Not yet. But clarity. "The community supper," she said. He frowned. "What about it?" "There's one scheduled for next month. The county gathering." She leaned forward slightly. "People come from all over the territory for those. Merchants, ranchers, the people with money to invest. I know what a county gathering is. I'm asking if you've ever used it to build relationships rather than just attend it." He opened his mouth, closed it. The truth was that he attended the county gathering every year the way he attended church, as a civic obligation, with his hat on and his best coat and his most neutral expression. And he shook hands and spoke when spoken to and left as soon as it was polite to do so. "I tend to keep to myself at those events," he admitted. "I know," Margaret said. "Clyde told me. Clyde talks too much. Clyde is worried about you and has been for years." She said it without accusation. "So is everyone who works here. They just don't know how to say it to you because you've arranged your life so that people feel they shouldn't." Nathaniel was quiet. "The supper," she continued. "Let me cook. You want to cook for the county gathering. I want to cook for it the way it's never been cooked for before." Her voice was steady, But there was something underneath it. Not excitement, exactly more like the calm certainty of a person who knows exactly what they're capable of. You need people to see Carter Ranch as more than just a successful cattle operation. You need them to see it as a community anchor, somewhere that belongs to this territory. And food does that. Food is the oldest language there is, Margaret said simply. It always has been. He looked at her across his desk. His wife. The plain woman from Iowa who had arrived with one suitcase and the expectation of disappointment. The woman who had walked into his ranch and within 1 week made his men feel seen, made his kitchen feel alive, and was now sitting across from him in his study, talking about community strategy and human connection, as if she'd been doing it her whole life. She probably had been. He just hadn't known where to look for it. "All right," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "Plan the supper," he said. "Do it the way you want to do it. Whatever you need supplies, help time you have it." Something moved across her face. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter and more complicated, something that made him realize she hadn't been certain he would say yes. That even now, even after weeks of this, she was still waiting for the moment when he would decide she wasn't worth the investment. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me. I know I don't need to." She stood smoothing her skirt with the habitual gesture he'd come to recognize as something she did when she was containing an emotion. "But I want to." She left his study. He sat at his desk in the lamplight, and he thought about the word partner, and he thought about how the thing he had believed he'd lost forever. The particular feeling of not being entirely alone in the world had appeared in his house and surprised him thoroughly and was currently planning a supper that might save his ranch. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He was fairly sure that for the first time in 6 years, he was curious to find out. The morning after Nathaniel said yes to the supper, Margaret was up before 4. Not because she was anxious, because she was thinking. And when Margaret was thinking, she needed her hands to be doing something. Thinking without her hands occupied was how she ended up lying in the dark, cataloging everything that could go wrong. And she had learned a long time ago that the dark had a way of making things seem larger and more permanent than they actually were. So she made bread. She made 3 loaves before the sun came up, and she worked through what she knew and what she needed to know and what the shape of the next 6 weeks had to look like. She thought about the county gathering. She thought about the people who would come. She thought about Nathaniel sitting in his study, with that bank letter in his hand, absorbing it alone, the way he absorbed everything carrying it, the way a man carries a stone he's convinced himself he deserves to carry. She thought about the word he hadn't said, the word she'd introduced, and he'd taken up without comment, partner. She thought about how much she wanted to be that, not for the ranch, not for the money, or the security, or any of the practical reasons a woman in her position might have for wanting to make herself indispensable to a wealthy man. She'd been honest with herself about that a long time ago, in the weeks after she'd sent the letter, and was waiting for his reply and examining her own motives with the same direct assessment she applied to everything else. She wanted it because she was good at it. She was good at seeing what people needed. She was good at making things work. She was good at building something out of the ordinary materials of daily life, and she had spent 30 years being good at those things in contexts where no one had room to appreciate them. And she could admit this to herself in the 4 o'clock quiet of a Wyoming kitchen. She was hungry for a place where what she was good at actually mattered. Nathaniel Carter had given her that without entirely meaning to. She punched the dough down and started the second shape. The problem was, she liked him. She hadn't expected to like him. She had expected a transaction, a reasonable man, a manageable arrangement, mutual benefit on both sides, and perhaps eventually a kind of companionship. She had expected someone she could respect and work alongside and over time grow accustomed to. She had not expected a man who listened the way Nathaniel listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but actually taking in what she said, turning it over, treating her words as things worth considering. She had not expected someone whose grief was so fully formed and so quietly carried that it made her recognize something she'd seen before in the mirror, the expression of a person who had made peace with loss by convincing themselves they didn't need what they'd lost. She hadn't expected to see herself in him. That was the part that made this complicated. She put the loaves in the oven and sat down with her coffee, and she told herself what she always told herself when things got complicated: deal with what's in front of you. One thing at a time. Today the thing in front of you is the supper, and the supper is how you help, and helping is what you know how to do. She got out her paper and began to write a list. By the time the men started coming in for breakfast, she had 3 pages covered in her small, careful handwriting, and a plan that was either going to be the best thing she'd ever done or the most public failure of her life. She chose not to think about which. She told Nathaniel over breakfast. He came in when most of the men were already seated, and she set his coffee in front of him and took the chair across the table. She'd stopped waiting to be invited to sit, because waiting to be invited in your own house was a habit she was leaving behind, and she put her 3 pages in front of him. He looked at them. He picked up the first page and read without comment the way he did everything, taking it in completely before responding. "You want to invite the Halcott brothers," he said. "They control the grain distribution for the eastern part of the territory. We have an existing relationship with their competitors. I know. That's why inviting them matters." She kept her voice level. "You want people to see Carter Ranch as neutral ground, somewhere that belongs to the whole community, not just to one set of business interests." He turned to the second page. 200 people, he said. Minimum. He looked up. "The gathering usually draws that many anyway," she said. "I'm not suggesting we create something from nothing. I'm suggesting we make this year's gathering happen here at this ranch and make it something people remember." "Why would people come here specifically?" "Because of what I'm planning to cook." The men at the table had gone slightly quiet. Not obvious about it, they were all looking at their plates with great attention, but the room was listening. Nathaniel set down the pages. "Tell me." So she told him. She talked about the menu she was planning. Not just food, a particular kind of food, the kind that didn't exist anywhere in this territory, because it required skills that most cooks in Wyoming didn't have, the preservation techniques and the particular bread traditions she'd learned from her mother's mother and refined over 10 years of cooking for other people. She talked about what she could make from the ranch's own larder, and what she'd need to source and what she'd need help with. She talked for about 12 minutes without stopping. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Clyde, who was sitting at the end of the table, set down his coffee cup. "I want to eat at this supper," he said. 2 of the other men laughed. Nathaniel looked at the pages again. "You'll need help," he said. "I'll need 4 women who can follow direction and aren't afraid of hard work. I know 4 women exactly like that." He turned to Clyde. "Talk to Harmon's wife, and the Delacroix sisters if they're available." Clyde nodded. "And Margaret." He looked at her. "Whatever you need from the supply account, you have it." She had prepared herself to argue for that. She had a whole second argument ready about the return on investment and the community goodwill and the business case, because she had assumed he would need to be convinced on the expense. He hadn't needed convincing. She absorbed that quietly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said and stood. "Make it worth the trouble." And she thought, "I intend to." The trouble she hadn't planned for arrived on Tuesday. Her name was Victoria Whitmore. Margaret had heard the name before she arrived. You couldn't spend 3 weeks at Carter Ranch without hearing about the Whitmore family. Halcott Territory to the west, Whitmore Territory to the north. Carter Territory in the center, that was the rough geography of power in the county, and everyone on the ranch knew it and navigated around it the way people navigate around large rocks in a stream. Victoria Whitmore was 26 years old, the only daughter of George Whitmore, and she was by universal agreement in the county one of the most beautiful women in Wyoming Territory. Nathaniel's men mentioned her the way men always mention beautiful women they have no access to, with a particular mixture of admiration and resignation. Even Clyde, who was not a man given to gossip, had said once, "The Whitmore girl has always had an opinion about this ranch." Margaret had filed that away without pressing. Now Victoria Whitmore was standing in her kitchen. She had arrived without being invited, which apparently was a thing she did because her own position in the county meant that most doors were open to her by default. She had arrived with a basket of preserves, a social call, technically a neighborly gesture, and she had come through the front door and into the kitchen with the ease of someone who had been in this house before and knew its geography. She was, Margaret noted with the same flat assessment she applied to everything, extraordinarily beautiful. Not just pretty beautiful, in the structured, striking way of a woman who had always known she was beautiful and had learned how to use that knowledge with precision. She was also, in the first 30 seconds of their introduction, the most uncomfortable presence Margaret had been in since she left Iowa. "Mrs. Carter," Victoria said. "I've been meaning to call since I heard the news." "Miss Whitmore." Margaret kept her hands busy at the counter because she worked best when her hands were occupied, and she didn't see any reason to stop working just because someone had arrived unannounced. "Can I offer you coffee?" "Please." Victoria set the basket on the table and sat down without being asked, which Margaret noted. "I brought some of our peach preserves. We had an exceptional harvest this year." "That's kind of you. I hope you're settling in well? Wyoming must be quite a change from Iowa." "It is," Margaret said. "I like it." Victoria's eyes moved around the kitchen, taking it in. Margaret watched her do it without appearing to watch the way she watched most things, from an angle, catching the peripheral details while keeping her expression neutral. "You've made changes in here," Victoria said. "Some. Nathaniel never used to have a kitchen table for the workers. It works better this way." "I imagine it does." Victoria accepted the coffee Margaret set in front of her with the automatic grace of a woman who had been served things her entire life. "He must be pleased." "You'd have to ask him." Victoria smiled. It was a practiced smile, Margaret thought. It arrived too quickly and stayed too precisely. "How are you finding life on the ranch truly? I imagine it can be isolating for someone from outside the territory." "I've been busy," Margaret said. She turned back to the counter. "We're planning the county gathering here this year." A pause. "Here," Victoria said. "Nathaniel thought it was time to bring the community to the ranch properly. I'm organizing the food." Another pause. Longer. "That's quite an undertaking," Victoria said. "The county gathering usually happens at the Ridgeline Meeting Hall." "It usually does. This year will be different." Margaret could feel the shift in the room without turning around. The slight recalibration of Victoria's approach, something adjusting, something calculating. "Nathaniel didn't mention this," Victoria said. "I imagine he's been busy." Margaret turned now because she decided it was time to face this directly. She leaned against the counter with her arms loose at her sides and looked at Victoria Whitmore with the same clear, assessing look she gave to everything she needed to understand. "Is there something I can help you with, Miss Whitmore?" The smile again. "I just wanted to introduce myself properly, welcome you to the community." "That's very kind. We've known Nathaniel a long time. The Whitmore family and the Carters have always been close." "He's told me a little about the families in the area," Margaret said. "He respects your father greatly." Something moved behind Victoria's eyes. Not quite disappointment. Something more complicated than disappointment. "Yes," she said. "My father thinks very highly of Nathaniel." "I'll tell him you called," Margaret said pleasantly. "I know he'd want to know." Victoria left 20 minutes later, taking her basket of peach preserves back with her, because Margaret had declined to accept them politely, but clearly on the grounds that the ranch's larder was already well supplied. She watched the Whitmore buggy disappear down the road. Then she went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and she let herself feel the thing she'd been keeping below the surface of her expression for the duration of that visit. The particular ancient exhaustion of a woman who has watched a beautiful woman look at her and find her lacking, and known that the beautiful woman was doing it, and known that everyone in the room could see the calculation happening, and had had to stand there and be assessed and found insufficient in someone else's accounting. She had felt that her whole life. She had learned how to survive it. But survival wasn't the same as not feeling it. She picked up her list and got back to work. Nathaniel heard about Victoria's visit from Clyde because Clyde heard about everything that happened on the ranch, and he went looking for Margaret that afternoon. He found her in the supply room off the kitchen, taking inventory with the methodical attention she brought to every task, moving along the shelves and writing numbers in a small ledger. She didn't look up when he came in. "Clyde told you," she said. "Clyde tells me most things." He leaned against the doorframe. "What happened?" "She came to call. We had coffee. She left." "Margaret." She stopped writing and turned. Her face was composed, but he'd been watching her face long enough by now to see the difference between composed and untouched, and this was composed. "She wanted to see what you'd chosen," Margaret said. "I understand that. I would have done the same thing in her position." Her position. She expected to be in my position. She said it simply, without venom. "Anyone in the county could have told you that." "I don't imagine it was a secret." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you about it," she said. "Whatever was between you and the Whitmore family before I came here, that's yours. I'm just telling you what the visit was." "Nothing was between Victoria Whitmore and me," Nathaniel said. "All right, I mean it. Her father had ideas, perhaps. She may have had expectations. I never gave her reason for them." "Nathaniel!" She turned back to the shelf. "I believe you. You don't need to explain yourself." He stood there for a moment. "She upset you." "She reminded me of something I already knew." Her voice was even. She was writing numbers again. "That some people will always look at me and see what's missing instead of what's there. I'm used to it. It doesn't mean I enjoy it." He didn't know what to say to that. He was not a man who knew what to say to that kind of honesty. He was more comfortable with problems he could solve than feelings he could only witness. But he stepped into the supply room instead of stepping back, and he stood beside her at the shelves, and he said, "What do you need counted next?" She looked at him. "The flour inventory," she said after a moment. "Tell me what to write." She told him what to write. She called out the numbers, and he wrote them in the ledger. He wasn't used to small, neat work. His handwriting was the large scrawl of a man who wrote things to be read from a distance, and she glanced at it once and didn't comment. And they worked through the rest of the supply room together, in a silence that was as their silences tended to be more communicative than most people's conversations. When they were done, she closed the ledger. "Clyde thinks you should go to the Whitmore gathering next week," she said. "He thinks it would smooth things over before the county supper." "Clyde can think whatever he likes." "He's right, though." Nathaniel looked at her. "You need George Whitmore's goodwill for the next few months," she said. "The Whitmores have relationships with two of the banks you use. You know that better than I do." She held the ledger against her chest. "I'm not asking you to be dishonest. I'm asking you to be strategic. You want me to go to a Whitmore gathering. I want you to go, and I want you to take me." He stared at her. "If you go without me," she said, "it looks like you're apologizing for your choice. If you go with me, it looks like there's nothing to apologize for." She met his eyes. "There isn't anything to apologize for, is there?" It wasn't quite a question. "No," Nathaniel said. "There isn't." "Then take me to the Whitmore gathering, and let me meet your neighbors." She turned toward the door. "And tell Clyde he was right. He'll be insufferable about it for a week, but he deserves to know." She walked out of the supply room. Nathaniel stood there a moment in the room that smelled of flour and dried herbs, holding the ledger she'd handed him. And he thought, "I have never in my adult life met a person who thinks the way she thinks, and I am not sure yet whether that is the most reassuring or the most alarming thing that has ever happened to me." He put the ledger on the shelf. He went to find Clyde. The Whitmore gathering was held on a Saturday, and it was exactly the kind of event Nathaniel had always endured rather than enjoyed, large, expensive, and organized for the purpose of demonstrating the Whitmore family's position in the county rather than for the pleasure of the people attending. George Whitmore was a big man in his early 60s, red-faced and expansive, with the particular confidence of someone who had been wealthy long enough that he'd forgotten there was any other way to be. He shook Nathaniel's hand at the door with genuine warmth, whatever else could be said about George Whitmore. His regard for Nathaniel Carter was real, and his eyes moved immediately to Margaret. "Mrs. Carter." He took her hand with a slight bow. "George Whitmore, I've been looking forward to meeting the woman who finally convinced this man to do something sensible." Margaret smiled. "Mr. Whitmore, Nathaniel speaks well of you." "Does he?" "He never speaks well of anyone. He must like you very much." He laughed at his own joke. Nathaniel did not visibly react, which was also a kind of reaction. Margaret filed all of it and moved forward. The gathering was full of people who had a way of looking at her, a brief assessment, a recalibration, a polite neutrality settling over their faces. That was its own kind of verdict. She had seen it at every point in her life where she'd been somewhere she wasn't expected. She had learned that the only answer to it was to be so genuinely herself that people eventually had to respond to the actual person instead of their expectation of her. She talked to people. She asked questions, real ones, not social ones. She asked the grain merchant about his supply lines. She asked the school board chairman's wife about the shortage of teachers she'd mentioned in passing. She asked an elderly rancher named Pemberton about the drought conditions he'd been describing to Nathaniel, and she asked a follow-up question that made him stop mid-sentence and look at her with real attention. "Where did you learn about water tables?" he asked. "My grandfather was a farmer in Ohio," she said. "Bad years taught us more than good years." Pemberton looked at her for a long moment. "You're Carter's wife." "I am." He did well. Pemberton said bluntly. "Better than most of them expected." Before she could respond, she heard Victoria's voice behind her. "Mrs. Carter." Victoria appeared at her elbow with the smooth social motion of someone who had grown up in rooms like this. "Are you enjoying yourself?" "Very much," Margaret said. "You have a beautiful home." She said it without subtext because it was true and because she didn't have the energy for subtext. Victoria seemed almost thrown by the absence of it. "Thank you." She glanced toward where Nathaniel was talking with her father. "He looks well. I don't think I've seen him this present at a gathering in years." "He's been working hard. He deserves an evening away from the ranch." "Yes." Victoria's eyes stayed on him a moment longer. Then she looked at Margaret. "Can I ask you something directly? Please. Did you know about this ranch before you wrote the letter? Did you know what it was worth?" Margaret looked at her, not with anger, with the clean, simple attention she gave to questions that deserved to be taken seriously. "I knew he had land and cattle," she said. "That's what the agency told me. I didn't know the size of it until I arrived." She paused. "Is that what you wanted to know?" Victoria's jaw tightened. "I suppose I'm wondering if you understand what you have." "I understand what I have," Margaret said quietly. "I'm not sure it's what you think I have. He's one of the wealthiest men in the territory." "Yes." Margaret looked at Nathaniel across the room, at the line of his shoulders, at the particular way he was listening to George Whitmore, that complete, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered to him. "But what I have isn't the ranch." Victoria was quiet. "I have a man who listens to me," Margaret said. "I have a man who hands me bank letters because he's decided I'm someone he can share hard things with. I have a man who came into the supply room and wrote numbers in a ledger because he didn't know how to say he was sorry that my feelings got hurt." She looked back at Victoria. "That's what I have. And I don't imagine that's what you were planning for." Victoria stared at her. Margaret smiled. Not the practiced smile, the real one. "Thank you for the gathering. The food is very good." She moved away toward Nathaniel. "'Kay." On the drive home, she told him what had happened, not because she had to, not to seek his defense or his reassurance. She told him because they had agreed without ever explicitly saying it that they were going to tell each other the truth, and this was part of the truth of that evening. He listened. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins, and he listened. When she finished, the wagon was quiet for a moment. "What she asked you," he said. About whether you knew what the ranch was worth. Yes. Did that bother you? Yes, she said. And no. She thought about it. It bothered me the way it always bothers me when someone assumes the worst about my reasons. But I understand why she asked. From where she's standing, I'm someone she can't explain, and people invent explanations for things they can't explain. You told her what you have. I told her the truth. He was quiet. Was that wrong? She asked. No. His voice was low. No, it wasn't wrong. The wagon moved through the dark. The night was cold and enormous, the kind of Wyoming sky that reminded you how small you were. All those stars and all that black, and Margaret sat beside him in the dark and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe, not because of the wealth, not because of the ranch, because of the man beside her who took up exactly the amount of space he needed, and no more, who didn't perform anything, who was simply and entirely himself, complicated and closed off, and gradually, slowly, like a window opening in a room that had been sealed for years, letting in light. I need to tell you something, Nathaniel said. She waited. The bank situation is worse than I said last week. She kept her expression still. How much worse? He told her. The numbers were serious. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the margin was thinner than he'd let on, and the timeline was tighter, and there was a possibility, not a certainty, not even a probability, but a real possibility, that if the cattle market didn't improve before fall, they would be facing decisions she needed to know about. She listened to all of it. She didn't panic. She didn't perform calm to cover panic. She just took it in the way she took in everything, with the careful, steady attention of someone who had survived hard things by facing them directly. Why are you telling me now? She asked. He thought about that. Because you told Victoria Whitmore that you're someone I share hard things with. She felt something move in her chest, and I decided, he continued, still watching the road, that I should make that true, not just something you say, something I actually do. She looked at him for a long moment, at his profile in the dark, at the set of his jaw, and the way he held the reins, and the absolute stillness of a man who has just said something that cost him something to say. Then we'll figure it out, she said. Together, he said. Together, she agreed. And the wagon moved through the Wyoming night, and neither of them said anything else, and the silence between them was the kind that builds something instead of leaving something empty. 3 days later, the first thing went wrong at the ranch that had nothing to do with money. It was Daniel. His shoulder had been getting worse, despite the 2 days of rest, and Margaret had noticed him guarding it during the morning meal, the slight shift of weight, the way he reached for the coffee cup with his left hand instead of his right. She said nothing at the table. She waited until he was leaving, and then she said quietly, "Stay a moment." He turned. "Your shoulder," she said. "It's fine. You're favoring it more than last week." "It's fine," he said again, and there was something in his voice that wasn't dismissal, something that was closer to fear, and she recognized it immediately because she'd heard it in people her whole life. The fear of needing something, the fear of being a burden. "Sit down, Daniel." "Ma'am, I've got—" "Sit down." He sat. She made him take off his jacket, and she looked at his shoulder carefully. She wasn't a doctor, but she'd grown up with a father who worked physical labor, and she knew the difference between a strain and something worse, and what she found was worse. "How long?" she asked. He was looking at the table. "Month, maybe 6 weeks." 6 weeks. "I can still work." "Not on that shoulder, you can't." She pulled his jacket back up. "Have you told Nathaniel?" "He's got enough to worry about." She looked at him. "Daniel?" "I don't want to be sent somewhere to rest up and lose my place here," he said. It came out quickly, like something he'd been holding for a long time. "I've been on this ranch 4 years. I know how it works. A man who can't pull his weight gets replaced," she said. He looked up, surprised by her bluntness. "That's what you're afraid of?" "Yes, ma'am." She sat down across from him. I'm going to tell you something about Nathaniel Carter, and I want you to hear it, not as reassurance, as fact. She waited until he was looking at her. He kept Clyde Harmon on this ranch for 14 years. He kept an old man named Prescott on the payroll for 3 years after Prescott couldn't do more than light work because Prescott had nowhere else to go, and Nathaniel knew it. He is not a man who discards people. Daniel stared at her. He doesn't say those things, she continued. He's not built for saying things, but he does them. If you tell him about your shoulder, the worst that happens is you spend 3 weeks on lighter work and come back stronger. If you don't tell him, and that shoulder gives out in the field. She stopped. Let him fill in the rest. He was quiet for a long time. Will you tell him? He finally asked. If I can't. I'll sit there while you tell him, she said. So you're not doing it alone. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he wasn't expecting to find in a place he knew well. Slightly stunned. Slightly grateful. Trying not to let the gratitude show too much because he was the kind of man who'd been taught that gratitude was a form of weakness. Thank you, he said. Tell him today, she said. Don't wait. He nodded. He got up. At the door he stopped. Mrs. Carter? He turned. Everybody here, we all know what you've done, since you came, for the ranch, for the... He stopped working for words that didn't come easy. We notice. She looked at him. I just wanted you to know that, he said. Somebody should say it out loud. He left. She sat at the kitchen table alone for a moment. She sat, with what he had said, with the weight of it, with the particular complicated feeling of being seen. Really seen, not assessed, not judged, seen, and finding it almost harder to bear than invisibility, because invisibility at least was familiar, and this was not. She got up. She had a supper to plan. She had 200 people to feed in 3 weeks, and a man's ranch to help save, and a marriage to build out of the raw materials of honesty and mutual respect, and the daily accumulating evidence that sometimes two people who expected very little from each other could surprise themselves entirely. She got out her lists. She got back to work. Outside, she heard Nathaniel's voice, and then Daniel's voice lower and more uncertain, and she heard the conversation begin, the one Daniel had been afraid to have, and she heard the particular shift in Nathaniel's voice that she was learning to recognize as the sound of a man who cared more than he knew how to say. She kept working. She didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew how it would go. The supper was 2 weeks away when Clyde found the letter. He didn't come to Nathaniel with it first. That was the thing that told Nathaniel immediately how serious it was, because Clyde Harmon had been bringing him problems for 14 years, and he had never once in those 14 years gone to anyone else first. He went to Margaret. She came to find Nathaniel in the east pasture at 8:15 in the morning, which was also unusual, because Margaret understood the rhythms of the ranch well enough by now to know that the east pasture before 9 was not a place for conversations that required stillness. She had to have decided the conversation couldn't wait. He saw her coming and stopped what he was doing. She walked up to him and held out a folded paper. No preamble, no softening. Clyde found this in the supply building this morning, she said. Behind the grain ledger. He thinks it was left deliberately. Nathaniel took it and read it. It was short, 8 lines. Written in a hand he didn't recognize, addressed to no one, signed by no one. But the content was precise enough that it hadn't needed a signature. It described the terms of his bank loan terms that were not public knowledge terms that existed in documents in his study and in the bank manager's files and nowhere else. It described his current shortfall with a specificity that made his jaw tighten. And it ended with 4 words that were not a threat so much as a statement of intention. The ranch will sell. He read it twice. He folded it. Who's seen this? He said. Clyde. Me. Now you. No one else. No one else. She was watching his face, not with anxiety, with the same careful, direct attention she always gave to things that mattered. Nathaniel. Someone inside this ranch put that there. I know. Or someone with access to it. He looked up. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that someone knows your financial situation in detail. That's not something a stranger knows. That's not something a competitor guesses. She kept her voice level. The terms of your loan, the specific numbers, that's information that came from somewhere. He was already moving. She kept pace beside him without being asked. The bank, he said. Possibly. Or someone the bank spoke to. She paused. Or someone who had access to your study. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. Who's been in your study? She asked. He thought. His study was not a room he opened to the ranch hands. It was not a room people wandered through. The door was usually closed, and the men on his property had been with him long enough to know that the study was Nathaniel Carter's private territory, the place where the business of the ranch lived, and they respected that. The way they respected most things on this property completely, and without needing to be reminded. But 3 weeks ago, a man from the bank had come to discuss the loan terms in person. He had sat in the study for 2 hours. He had seen the documents on the desk. Nathaniel had not thought anything of it at the time, because the man was from the bank, and the bank already had the information. There was a bank representative, he said slowly. 3 weeks ago. Who sent him? The bank, or... He stopped. Or, she said. The letter came through the bank manager's office, but the manager didn't select the representative. The representative was sent by the board. And who sits on the board? He was quiet for a long moment. Margaret waited. George Whitmore, he said. The name landed between them like something dropped from a height. She didn't react visibly. She absorbed it the way she absorbed everything. And then she said, Is George Whitmore capable of this? Nathaniel started walking again. 6 months ago, I would have said no. And now? Now I'm looking at a letter that contains information only the bank and my own household should have. And George Whitmore is on the bank board and sent a representative to my study 3 weeks ago. He pushed through the gate into the yard. So I don't know what I would say now. Clyde was waiting by the barn. Nathaniel walked up to him and said without greeting, The bank representative, 3 weeks ago. You remember him? Henderson, Clyde said. James Henderson, came down from Cheyenne. Did he go anywhere in the house besides the study? Clyde's jaw set. He asked to use the facilities. I walked him there and back. But you left him alone in the study. You were already in there with him. Before I got there. Clyde was quiet for a moment. 5 minutes, maybe 7. I put him in the study and went to get you from the north pasture. He looked at the folded paper in Nathaniel's hand. That's bad. Yes. How bad? Nathaniel looked at him. Someone is building a case for the bank to call the loan in full. If they can demonstrate that the ranch is in financial distress, and they have the numbers to do that, now they can go to the board and argue for immediate repayment. He kept his voice flat, factual, the way he dealt with bad things. If the loan gets called in full, I can't pay it. Not in the timeline they'd give me. I'd have to sell land. Clyde stared at him. How much land? Enough. Nathaniel? I know. He turned to Margaret. The supper is still happening. She had been listening. Of course it is. I want it moved up. 1 week. She blinked. 1 week less of preparation. I know what I'm asking. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I can do it, she said. I'll need 1 more woman, and I'll need the supply order placed today. Done. He turned back to Clyde. I need you to find out everything you can about Henderson and his connection to the Whitmore family. Quietly. No one on the ranch knows about this except the 3 of us. And Daniel, Clyde said. Especially not Daniel. He's carrying enough. Clyde nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't. He walked. Nathaniel stood in the yard with Margaret, and for a moment he let himself feel the full weight of it, not all the time. Not long, just enough to know what he was carrying so he could carry it properly. They're trying to take the ranch, he said. Yes, she said. Through the bank, legal and clean, nothing I can fight directly. Not through the bank, she agreed. But there are other ways to fight. He looked at her. The supper, she said. Nathaniel who comes to the county gathering. Everyone. Everyone with money. Everyone with standing. Everyone who makes decisions about what gets invested where and who gets support from the community and which operations are worth backing. She stepped closer. Not performance urgency. If Carter Ranch is seen as the center of this community, if the people at that gathering go home remembering that Nathaniel Carter is the man this territory is built around, then no bank board can quietly move against you without the entire county noticing. He stared at her. You can't fight it in a bank, she said. You fight it in a room full of people. He stood there with the letter in his hand and the weight of the last hour pressing down on him. And he thought about what kind of woman thought like that. What kind of person saw that angle, and he thought, I have been trying to solve this problem alone for 6 months, and this woman has been here 6 weeks and she just found the door. The supper, he said. The supper, she confirmed. All right. He folded the letter and put it in his coat. Then let's make it one they never forget. She worked like a force of nature the following days. There was no other way to describe it. Margaret Ellis Carter. She had started using both names now, quietly, without announcement. The way she did. Most things operated in those 10 days with a focused, sustained intensity that made even the hardest workers on the ranch stop and watch. Sometimes not because it was remarkable for a woman to work hard, but because the quality of her concentration was something different. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't frantic. She was moving at the pace of someone who had calculated exactly what needed to happen and in what order, and was executing it without waste. She had 4 women helping her. Clyde's wife Ruth, a compact and capable woman who took direction without ego. The Delacroix sisters Ada and June, who had grown up in a restaurant family and could produce volume without losing quality. And a woman named Bess, who had cooked for a cattle drive for 3 seasons, and had the particular skill of making good food under conditions that would have broken a lesser cook. Margaret ran her kitchen, like Nathaniel ran his ranch. Clear expectation, direct communication, no room for pretense. Ruth told Clyde that first evening that she'd never worked for someone who made her feel so simultaneously capable and absolutely clear about what was needed. Clyde told Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. Meanwhile, he was doing his own work. The invisible work of a man who knew that a battle was coming and was building his defenses before the other side had a chance to move. He sent letters to 3 men he trusted in Cheyenne, asking careful questions about James Henderson and the bank board's recent activities. He called in 2 favors he had been holding for years, from men who owed him enough to give him honest information without asking why he needed it. And every evening he came into the kitchen. Not because he needed to. Not to check on the preparations. He came because the kitchen had become the place on his ranch where he could breathe, and he had only recently admitted to himself that the reason for that was the woman who ran it. They had developed a ritual without planning one. He would come in, pour coffee, sit at the end of the counter, and they would talk about the supper, about the ranch, about whatever needed saying. Sometimes it was practical. Sometimes it went somewhere else entirely. Margaret had a way of asking questions that opened things up rather than closing them down, and Nathaniel had found to his own considerable surprise that he had things to say that he'd been storing for 6 years with no one to say them to. Tell me about Eleanor, she said one evening. He looked up from his coffee. She was rolling pastry, her hands steady and practiced. You don't have to. But you mention her sometimes in the middle of other things, the way people mention someone they still talk to in their head. I wondered what she was like. He was quiet for a moment. He could have deflected. He was very good at deflecting. But he thought about what he'd told himself on the wagon ride home from the Whitmore gathering. That partner wasn't something you said, it was something you did. And he set down his cup. She was funny, he said. People always looked at her and expected serious because she had a serious face. But she had the driest sense of humor of anyone I ever knew. She'd say something so deadpan that you'd be 3 sentences further into the conversation before you realized she'd made a joke, and by then she'd be looking at you with that expression. He stopped, surprised himself. What expression? Margaret asked, still rolling, not looking at him, giving him room. Like she was very patiently waiting for you to catch up, he said. Margaret's mouth curved. She would have been sharp about the bank situation, he said. She always saw around corners. I think I would have liked her. He looked at her. She would have liked you. Margaret paused in her rolling. Not long, just a beat, just a breath. Then she kept going. I'm not trying to be her, she said. I want you to know that. I know that's sometimes what people expect when a man remarries, that the second wife is supposed to fill the shape of the first one. You don't fill a shape, Nathaniel said. You make new ones. She looked at him then, something in her face that she didn't often let him see, something undefended, something that was simply a woman heard and surprised by being heard. That's the kindest thing you've said to me, she said. I mean it. I know you do. She turned back to the pastry. That's why it's kind. They stayed in the kitchen another hour, and Nathaniel thought that there was something quietly extraordinary about the fact that he had sat in this room for 6 years, feeling only the weight of what was gone, and now he sat in it, feeling something entirely different. Not replacement, not forgetting. Something additive. Something that existed alongside the grief, rather than demanding it move. He went to bed that night feeling less alone than he'd felt since 1879. The first break came from Clyde. He came to the study on a Thursday evening with a look on his face that Nathaniel recognized, the look of a man who has found something he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to find. Henderson, Clyde said, and put a piece of paper on the desk. Nathaniel picked it up and read. James Henderson had been a bank representative in Cheyenne for 11 years. Clean record, no irregularities, the kind of steady, unremarkable career that looked good, precisely because nothing looked wrong. But one of Nathaniel's contacts in Cheyenne had dug deeper, the way only a man who had grown up in a town and knew every family and every connection could dig, and what he'd found was this: Henderson's sister had married into the Whitmore family 9 years ago. Not a close connection, a distant one, easy to miss if you weren't looking, but a connection. And 6 weeks ago, 2 weeks before Henderson's visit to Carter Ranch, Henderson had transferred to a new supervisory position. A position that had been created by a vote of the bank board. A vote on which George Whitmore had voted in favor. Nathaniel set the paper down. Whitmore created the position, he said. And filled it with Henderson, Clyde said. And then sent Henderson here. To see the documents. Nathaniel was very still. And then the letter appears in our supply building. With your exact loan figures in it. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. What does Whitmore want? The land, Clyde said. Your north quarter connects to his east pasture. He's wanted that connection for 15 years. You've turned him down twice. Twice? Nathaniel confirmed. A third time, Clyde said. If the bank calls the loan and you have to sell, you won't be turning anyone down. The land will go to whoever has the money ready. Nathaniel sat back. This was the shape of it. Not a sudden attack, but a patient scheme, the kind that could only be built by someone who was willing to wait years for the right moment. Whitmore had waited until the market softened. Waited until the loan terms were vulnerable. Then he'd moved Henderson into position and sent him to Carter Ranch to gather the specific information needed to push the bank board toward calling the loan. It was sophisticated. It was careful. And it explained something that had been nagging at Nathaniel since the letter appeared. Victoria's visit, he said. Clyde looked at him. She came to the ranch the week after Henderson left, Nathaniel said. I thought it was personal. Her father may have sent her to see how the ranch was running, whether the financial pressure was showing yet, whether I looked like a man who was struggling. He thought of Margaret standing in the kitchen, calm and unhurried, sending Victoria away with her basket of preserves unreceived. He thought of what Victoria had seen: a ranch that ran smoothly, workers who were settled, and fed a woman at the center of it, who gave away nothing in her expression. Victoria had gone back to her father and told him Carter Ranch looked fine, which was why the letter had appeared afterward. They were trying to create visible pressure since the ranch wasn't showing it naturally. The supper, Nathaniel said. 4 days. Clyde said. Is Margaret ready? You should ask her. He should ask her. He went to the kitchen. She was alone. The other women had gone home for the evening, and Margaret was doing what she always did at this hour. The last of the preparation, the things that required quiet and concentration, her hands moving through the familiar motions of her craft, with the settled confidence of someone entirely in their element. She looked at his face when he came in. Tell me, she said. He told her. All of it. Whitmore Henderson, the North Quarter, the board vote 15 years of a patient plan. He laid it out in the same flat, direct way he'd laid out the bank letter because she had earned that directness and because he didn't know how to give her anything less. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He's been planning this for how long? Best I can tell, 2 years of active setup. But the desire for the North Quarter has been there 15 years. And he used his own daughter's visit to assess the situation. That's what I think. Something crossed her face that was harder than anything he'd seen on it before. Not anger exactly. Something cooler than anger. She didn't know. What? Victoria didn't know. Margaret said it carefully, working through it. She came here because her father asked her to check on things. She's not part of the scheme. She's a tool he used without telling her. Nathaniel hadn't thought of it that way. He thought of it now. Does that matter? He asked. It might. She turned back to her work. It might matter very much depending on what happens at the supper. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, she said slowly, that George Whitmore has made a mistake. He's smart enough to build a 15-year plan, but he's not smart enough to know that the most dangerous person in a room isn't always the one with the most money. She was quiet for a moment. Sometimes it's the one who made the food. He looked at her. She almost smiled. 4 days, she said. Let me work. The morning of the supper, Nathaniel came downstairs at 5 to find Margaret already at the stove, and Ruth and Ada and June were at the counter, and Bess was working the secondary prep, and the kitchen had an energy that reminded him of the moments before a cattle drive, when everything was loaded and the men were ready, and the only thing left was to move. He stood in the doorway and watched for a moment without them seeing him. Margaret was directing the room with quiet precision. A word here, a gesture there, nothing raised, nothing performed. Just a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and trusted the people around her to do what they were capable of. He thought I almost didn't write back to that letter. He thought I sat at this table with a cold cup of coffee, and I almost decided that what I already had was enough. He thought about what Clyde had told him 6 months ago, that keeping everything running wasn't the same as being alive, and he thought that he had not understood what that meant until the woman at that stove walked into his kitchen and made it a room where something lived. Margaret looked up. Across the distance of the kitchen, she read his expression with the ease of someone who had been reading him for months. Breakfast is on the counter, she said. Eat before people start arriving. He ate. They started arriving at noon. By 2 o'clock, the Carter Ranch yard held more people than Nathaniel had seen on his property in 20 years. The community had come, truly come, not the polite attendance of obligation, but the real presence of people who had heard something interesting was happening and wanted to be part of it. The food was the reason. It spread ahead of the event, the way stories spread from a neighbor's mention to a wife's curiosity, to a traveler's comment, until people from 3 counties distant had rearranged their Saturday to drive to Carter Ranch because someone had told them something was being cooked there that they would not see again in their lifetime. Margaret had not exaggerated. What she and her 4 women had produced was something that had no category in Wyoming in 1885. It was not the simple, generous food of a cattle drive or the formal, aspirational food of a wealthy household trying to impress. It was food that felt like a place, like a specific, real-rooted place, where people had been feeding each other for generations, where the recipes carried memory, and the memory made the food mean more than the ingredients. Nathaniel watched people eat. He watched faces change. An old rancher named Comstock took a bite of Margaret's bread, a particular loaf made with a technique her grandmother had carried from Germany through Ohio and into Iowa, and he stopped chewing and looked at it like a man who had just remembered something he hadn't known he'd forgotten. A group of merchants from the eastern part of the territory gathered around the preserved foods table and were talking with each other in a way they hadn't been talking 10 minutes ago, animated and connected the food. Having done what food does, when it's made with real craft, it opened people up, and Margaret moved through all of it. Not performing hostess. Not working the room in the way of someone trying to make an impression. Just present. Stopping to talk to people, answering questions about the food with the plain, honest pleasure of someone who loved what they made, asking questions in return, making people feel that this place was genuinely glad they were here. Pemberton, the old rancher, who had asked her about water tables at the Whitmore gathering, found her by the bread table and said, "Mrs. Carter, I've been telling people about you for 2 weeks." "What have you been telling them?" "That this ranch finally has what it needed." He looked around the yard. "This is the heart of this community right here. This is what a gathering is supposed to feel like." Nathaniel was standing close enough to hear that. He said nothing, but he filed it precisely the way he filed everything that mattered. George Whitmore arrived at 2:30. He came with his wife and Victoria and 3 men. Nathaniel didn't recognize immediately, but identified within 5 minutes. 2 were investors from Cheyenne, and 1 was a man named Aldous Crane, who served as the legal representative for the bank board. They had come to see a ranch under pressure. They found a celebration. Whitmore's face was excellent years of careful social training kept it neutral. But Nathaniel had been watching men's faces in negotiations for 2 decades, and he saw the micro-adjustment that happened when George Whitmore walked into that yard and saw 200 people eating and talking and laughing and looking at Carter Ranch like it was the most important piece of land in the territory. Victoria saw it too. She was standing just behind her father, and she looked at the crowd, and then she looked at Margaret moving through it, and something in her expression did something complicated. Nathaniel watched it happen. Nathaniel walked forward to meet George Whitmore. "George?" He extended his hand. "Glad you could make it." "Nathaniel." Whitmore's handshake was firm and practiced. "Quite a gathering." "My wife's idea. She has a talent for bringing people together." He watched Whitmore's eyes move to Margaret. "So I see," Whitmore said. The 3 men behind him, the investors and Crane, were also looking at the crowd, and Nathaniel could see them recalibrating, could see the calculation happening in real time. This is not a ranch under financial duress. This is a ranch that is the center of its community. This is not a man you move quietly against without the entire territory noticing. Aldous Crane said something to one of the investors too low for Nathaniel to catch. The investor shook his head slightly. Nathaniel absorbed that and kept his expression easy. "Let me introduce you to some people," he said to Whitmore. "There's a man from the Northern Territory who's been asking about the kind of cattle partnerships you've been building." He gestured forward. "This way." He walked George Whitmore directly into the center of the gathering, surrounded by 200 people who were eating his wife's food and feeling the particular warmth of people who have been genuinely welcomed somewhere, and he let the man feel the weight of what he'd tried to undermine. He did it with a smile. He did it without saying a single word about any of it. The moment he'd been waiting for came 2 hours later. He found it not where he expected, but where Margaret had predicted. Victoria had found her. He saw them from across the yard, Margaret standing near the bread table, Victoria approaching with the careful walk of a woman who has decided to do something difficult and is committed now and can't turn back. He moved toward them without hurrying. He wanted to hear. He needed to hear. He caught it from 10 feet away. "My father sent Henderson to your ranch," Victoria said. Margaret looked at her steadily. "I know. I didn't know that when I visited." Her voice was controlled, but barely. "I came because he asked me to see how things were. He told me it was a social call, a welcome." She stopped. "He used me." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "You knew." "I suspected." Victoria's jaw tightened. "He wants your land. He's been working toward this for years, using the bank, using Henderson, using me." She said the last two words like they cost her something. I found documents in his study yesterday. I wasn't looking for them. I was looking for a letter he'd promised to give me, and I found... She stopped. I found what he's been building. Nathaniel was close enough now. Margaret saw him. Victoria turned and saw him too. The three of them stood there, and the noise of 200 people filled the air around them, and Nathaniel looked at the daughter of the man who had been trying to take his ranch for 15 years, and he saw a woman who had just discovered that her father was not the man she thought he was. Victoria, he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright in the way that meant she was holding something back by will. What did you find? He said. Documents, she said. Correspondence between my father and Crane at the bank, and a draft letter intended for the board, arguing that Carter Ranch is insolvent and should have its loan called immediately. She paused. With figures that could only have come from Henderson's visit here. Do you have the documents? Margaret asked. Victoria looked at her. The documents, Victoria, Margaret said quietly. Do you have them with you? She reached into the small bag she was carrying. Her hands were not quite steady. She withdrew a folded set of papers and held them out. Margaret took them. She looked at Nathaniel. He took them from her and looked at the first page and understood immediately what he was holding. Not just evidence of Whitmore's scheme. Documentation of bank fraud. Correspondence between a board member and a bank representative that constituted a clear, legal, actionable case of manipulation of financial proceedings. This wasn't just a defense. This was the end of the threat entirely. He looked up at Victoria. Why? He said. She was quiet for a moment. Because it's wrong, she said. Whatever I thought about your marriage, whatever I wanted. She looked at Margaret. This is wrong, and I'm not my father. Margaret looked at her for a long time. Then she said, Come inside. Have something to eat. Victoria stared at her. You've done something hard today, Margaret said. You should eat. And because Margaret said things directly and meant them completely, and because there was no calculation in her voice, and no cruelty, and no triumph, Victoria Whitmore did exactly that. She followed Margaret Ellis Carter into the Carter Ranch kitchen, and she sat at the table built for 12, and Margaret put bread and preserves in front of her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Outside, Nathaniel stood in the yard of his ranch with the documents in his hand and 200 people around him who were eating his wife's food and making his land feel like the center of something real, and he thought she said we'd fight it in a room full of people. She was right. She was right about most things. He put the documents in his coat pocket and went to find Aldous Crane, because George Whitmore had made his move. And now it was Nathaniel Carter's turn. Aldous Crane was standing near the fence at the edge of the yard, talking to one of the Cheyenne investors in the low, careful voice of a man conducting business while pretending not to conduct business. Nathaniel had known men like Crane his entire life. Men who operated in the spaces between things, between what was legal and what was wrong, between what could be proven and what everyone understood. They were useful to powerful people because they were technically clean. You could not point at Aldous Crane and say that man did something criminal. You could only say that man was always nearby when something criminal happened, and somehow he always left before the damage was visible. Nathaniel walked toward him at a pace that said, I am not hurrying, but I am coming, and you should not try to leave. Crane saw him coming. Nathaniel watched the calculation happen on the man's face, the quick assessment of the yard, the 200 people, the distance to the gate, the cost-benefit analysis running in real time. He watched Crane decide that leaving would look worse than staying. Smart enough to stay, not smart enough to understand that staying was also a trap. Mr. Crane, Nathaniel said. Mr. Carter. Crane's handshake was firm, professional. The handshake of a man with nothing to hide except that everyone had something to hide, and Nathaniel was currently holding proof of it in his coat pocket. Remarkable gathering. My wife's work, Nathaniel said. She has a gift. So I'm told. Crane glanced toward the kitchen. I didn't know she was involved in the management side of the ranch. She's involved in everything, Nathaniel said pleasantly. That's what a partner is. He let the word sit there. Let Crane hear it. The investor beside Crane, a man named Fitch Nathaniel, had placed him now a Cheyenne man, with fingers in 3 different cattle operations, and a seat on 2 company boards, had gone slightly quiet. I want to show you something, Nathaniel said. He pulled the documents from his coat. Not all of them. 1 page. He held it so that Crane could see it and Fitch could not quite see it, and he watched Crane's face with the attention of a man who has spent 40 years reading faces. What he saw was not the face of a man looking at something unfamiliar. What he saw was recognition. And recognition was everything. Where did you get that? Crane said. It was not quite a question. Does it matter? Nathaniel said. Crane stopped. He looked at Fitch, who was studying the middle distance with the careful attention of someone who has decided he doesn't want to know what's happening 6 inches to his left. Mr. Fitch, Nathaniel said, would you excuse us a moment? Fitch excused himself with the speed of a man grateful for permission to leave. Nathaniel and Crane stood together in the yard of Carter Ranch with 200 people around them who were eating and laughing and completely unaware that something was being settled very quietly in their midst. Here's what I know, Nathaniel said. He kept his voice level conversational, the voice he used when he wanted someone to understand that there was no emotion in what he was saying, only fact. I know that George Whitmore sent Henderson to my ranch to access my financial records. I know that information was used to prepare a case for the bank board to call my loan. I know that you were the legal mechanism through which that case was going to move. He folded the paper. Put it back. I know all of that because I have the correspondence. Crane was very still. I'm not going to the sheriff, Nathaniel said. Not today. Crane's stillness shifted slightly. Not relief, something more careful than relief. The loan terms, Nathaniel said, will be renegotiated, not called. Renegotiated on terms that reflect the actual standing of this ranch, which, as you can see, is somewhat healthier than the picture that was being assembled for the board. He gestured toward the yard, the people, the food, the vitality of a ranch that was nobody's definition of a failing operation. And George Whitmore's position on the bank board will become untenable, because the correspondence I have makes his involvement impossible to explain. You're asking me to... I'm telling you what's going to happen, Nathaniel said. You can be part of the legal process that makes it happen correctly, which protects your standing, or you can be part of the investigation that follows if I take this to the territorial authorities, which does not. He paused. You're a man who knows how to be on the right side of things at the right moment, Mr. Crane. This is one of those moments. Crane looked at him for a long time. He was smart. Nathaniel had never underestimated him. He was running the full calculation what he could protect, what he couldn't, what the documents contained, what Nathaniel could actually prove what a territorial investigation would cost a man in his position. The Whitmore connection, Crane said carefully. I was engaged by the board as legal representative. I know. My instruction came through the board process. I didn't the specifics of how the information was gathered. I know that too, Nathaniel said. I'm not asking you to fall on a sword. I'm asking you to stop the process and support the renegotiation, that's all. Crane looked at the yard again. Your wife organized this, he said. Yes. She knew. About Whitmore. About the board. She figured it out before I did, if I'm being honest. Something moved across Crane's face that was not quite admiration and not quite discomfort, somewhere between the two. George Whitmore told me this ranch was poorly managed, he said. That Carter had let things slip since his wife died. That the workforce was demoralized and the finances were deteriorating. And what do you see? Nathaniel said. Crane looked at the crowd, at the food tables, at the men from the ranch moving through the gathering with the ease of people who felt they belonged somewhere, at the energy that Margaret had built out of bread and honesty, and the daily accumulation of small, careful acts of attention. "I see a man," Crane said slowly, "who was poorly assessed." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He was." A pause. "I'll talk to the board," Crane said. "The renegotiation. I'll support it." "I appreciate that. And Whitmore." "Whitmore is his own problem now," Nathaniel said. "I have what I need." He left Crane by the fence and walked back into the crowd. He didn't find Margaret immediately. He moved through the gathering the way he'd been taught, stopping to speak, asking questions, listening with real attention, rather than the performative attention of a man who was simply waiting for the interaction to end. And he noticed that something had shifted in how people were responding to him. He couldn't pin it to a specific moment, but people were looking at him differently than they had at the Whitmore gathering 2 weeks ago. There he had been Nathaniel Carter, wealthy, respected, and somewhat remote. Here he was something else. Something that had to do with the food on the tables, and the workers who greeted the guests by name, and the woman who had built all of it, and the sense pervading the entire gathering like the smell of good bread, that Carter Ranch was a place where people mattered. He had not built that. She had. He found her at the far end of the yard, talking to Pemberton, who was apparently telling her something long and involved about his grandfather's farm in Tennessee, that she was listening to, with complete unhurried attention, as if she had nowhere else to be, and nothing else to do, which was not even slightly true. He waited. She caught his eye over Pemberton's shoulder. He gave her the smallest nod. He watched the information travel across her face, not a reaction exactly, more like a settling. The particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for confirmation of something they already knew and can now stop waiting. Pemberton eventually finished his story. Margaret thanked him warmly, asked one follow-up question that made the old man light up entirely, and then excused herself and walked to Nathaniel. "Crane," she said. "Done. Whitmore, his position on the board won't survive the month." She nodded. She looked at the yard. At the 200 people eating her food in the afternoon light of a Wyoming October. "Victoria," she said. "Is she still inside?" She was. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "She cried," she said. "In the kitchen. She tried not to, but she did. I gave her bread, and I didn't say anything about it." Nathaniel looked at her. She didn't know, Margaret said. About the scheme. She genuinely didn't know. Her father used her the way he used Henderson, the way he used the bank process. She was just a piece of it. Does it change what he did? "No," she said, "but it changes what she is." She turned to look at him. "What are you going to do about George?" He'd been thinking about this since Crane walked away. "Nothing criminal," he said. "Not because he doesn't deserve it. Because a criminal proceeding takes a year and costs money and puts this ranch in the newspapers as a place of conflict instead of a place of strength." He looked at the yard. "What I'm going to do is let the bank board see the correspondence. Let them handle their own member. The Whitmore family's standing in this county depends on their relationship with that board. When that relationship changes, everything else follows." "He loses the leverage," Margaret said. "He loses the leverage," Nathaniel confirmed, "and the land stays where it is." She was quiet for a moment. "You're being generous with him." "I'm being strategic." She looked at him. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He almost smiled. "No," he said, "they're not." They stood together in the yard of the ranch that had been in his family for 23 years, and Nathaniel felt something that had nothing to do with strategy or bank boards, or the particular satisfaction of a threat that had been neutralized. It was simpler than any of that. It was the feeling of standing beside someone who had stood beside him through the whole of something hard, and had not once suggested he handle it differently, or asked for credit in the handling of it, and had simply been there thinking alongside him, filling in the things he couldn't see from where he was standing. He thought, "I have been alone for 6 years, and I did not understand what alone cost until it stopped." He didn't say that. Not yet. He was a man who moved toward important things carefully, who needed to be sure before he spoke, and he wasn't sure yet, or he was sure, and wasn't ready, and he couldn't tell the difference between the two. "Are you hungry?" she said. He looked at her. "You haven't eaten since this morning," she said. "Come inside." He followed her inside. The afternoon wound down, the way good gatherings wind down. Gradually, people leaving with the reluctance of those who have been somewhere that felt genuinely good and are not quite ready to return to the ordinary. Nathaniel stood at the gate and said goodbye to each family as they left. And 3 separate men told him this was the best gathering the county had held in 20 years, and 2 women asked Margaret for the bread recipe. And Pemberton shook Nathaniel's hand at the gate and said, "Your wife is something else, Carter." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "She is." "Hold on to her." "I intend to." By 5 o'clock, the yard was empty except for the Carter household. Ruth and Ada and June and Bess were cleaning up with the efficient solidarity of women who had worked hard together towards something real. Clyde was walking the property with the quiet vigilance of a man who had been holding his breath for 2 weeks and was only now starting to let it out. Daniel was carefully with his healing shoulder guarded helping fold the tables, which Nathaniel noticed and did not comment on because Daniel needed to contribute and stopping him would cost more than it saved. And Margaret was in the kitchen. He found her at the sink washing the last of the large baking pans, her sleeves pushed up and her back to the door. She looked exhausted in the way of someone who had spent 10 days running toward something at full speed and had just crossed the line and wasn't sure yet how to stop. He picked up a cloth and started drying. She heard him, but didn't turn. "You don't have to do that." "I know." He dried the pan she handed him. She washed. He dried. The kitchen was warm and quiet around them, and outside the window the light was going gold and flat, the way Wyoming light went in October, that particular end-of-day quality that made everything look both more beautiful and more temporary than it actually was. "Margaret," he said. "I want to tell you something." She turned off the water. She dried her hands on her apron slowly, and then she turned to face him. He had planned something. He had been in the back of his mind arranging words since the afternoon since he stood in the yard after talking to Crane and understood fully and completely what she had done and what she had cost herself to do it. He had assembled a version of what he wanted to say that was orderly and correct and expressed what he meant without leaving him exposed in ways he wasn't sure how to manage. He forgot all of it. "You saved this ranch," he said. She opened her mouth. "Don't tell me you didn't," he said. "Don't minimize it. Don't say it was the food or the timing or that I would have figured it out anyway. You came here with 1 suitcase and in 6 weeks, you learned every man's name and fixed what was broken and planned the supper and thought of Crane before I did and brought Victoria into this kitchen when everyone else would have kept her out." He stopped, steadied something in himself. "You saved it." She was very still. "But that's not what I want to say," he continued. "The ranch is the ranch matters, and I'm grateful, but that's not—" He set down the drying cloth. He looked at her directly the way she had always looked at him, with the undeflected honesty that she had walked in with on the first day, and never put down. "I was managing," he said, "before you came. I want you to understand that word the way I mean it. Managing. Keeping everything running. Keeping the finances in order, and the men working, and the cattle healthy, and the property maintained. Managing." She was watching him. "I wasn't alive," he said. "I didn't know that until someone came and made the difference visible." He paused. "You made the difference visible." The kitchen was very quiet. "Nathaniel," she said, "I'm not finished." She closed her mouth. "I want to be a real husband to you," he said. "Not an arrangement, not a transaction. A husband the way I understand that word, which is incompletely probably because I have been alone for 6 years and I've forgotten most of what I knew about it. But I want to learn again." He stopped. "If that's something you want." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her thinking, could see the careful, precise intelligence working behind her eyes, assessing, examining, doing what she always did with things that mattered, which was to take them seriously rather than react to them immediately. "I came here," she said finally, expecting to be tolerated. He held her gaze. A woman like me. She stopped, started again. I have spent my whole life being the useful one, the capable one, the one people were glad to have around because of what she could do, not because of who she was. Her voice was even, but it cost her something to say it, and they both knew that. I thought this would be more of the same, a man who needed his house managed, who could tolerate my company because I was efficient. And instead, he said, and instead you came into a supply room and wrote numbers in a ledger, she said, and you handed me a bank letter before you'd found an answer for it, and you stood in front of 200 people and gave Crane back his own future because I told you that's where the battle was. Her eyes were bright. You trusted me. Yes. That's not something I expected. I know. She took a slow breath. I'm not easy, she said. I say what I mean, which irritates people. I get up before dawn, which irritates other people. I notice when things are wrong, and I say so, and I have opinions about how things should run, and I'm not the kind of woman who defers to a man simply because he's a man. I noticed all of those things, Nathaniel said, on the second day. And I found them the most sensible qualities I'd encountered in years. She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her really laugh. Not the small controlled sounds she sometimes made when something amused her, but a real laugh, surprised, unguarded, completely unperformed. And it did something to the room that he hadn't expected. It made it feel like the kitchen had always felt this way, like laughter had always lived here, like the 6 years of silence had simply been waiting for this specific sound to fill them. He crossed the kitchen. She didn't move back. He took her hand, the hand that had made bread for 40 workers, and soothed Daniel's shoulder, and written 3 pages of plans, and handed him bank letters and Virginia Whitmore's documents, and mixed pie dough at 4 a.m. while thinking through problems that he hadn't yet fully seen. He held it between both of his. I want to be a real husband, he said again. Quieter. If you'll let me. She looked at him. At the real him, not the rancher, not the wealthy man, not the person the county assessed when they heard the name Carter. The man who sat at a kitchen table at midnight with cold coffee and a letter he'd read until the paper went soft. Yes, she said. Simple, direct. The way she said everything. He didn't kiss her. Not yet, not in the kitchen with Ruth and the others still moving through the house. But he held her hand, and she let him, and that was enough for now. That was something he'd been building toward for 6 weeks without knowing that was what he was doing. And arriving there felt like setting down something heavy he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was weight. Clyde found him an hour later sitting on the porch. He came and sat beside him without being invited, which was the prerogative of a man who had worked beside you for 14 years, and he said nothing for a while. Crane, Clyde said finally. Dealt with. Whitmore. Being dealt with. A pause. The ranch, Clyde said. Is fine, Nathaniel said. We'll be fine. The loan gets renegotiated. The board loses 1 member. The North Quarter stays where it is. Clyde was quiet for a moment. She did that? We did it. Nathaniel. He looked at him. She did most of it, Clyde said. I'm not arguing with you about it. I'm just saying. What she built here in 6 weeks, the men, the gathering, the supper, figuring out Whitmore before you had the evidence. I've been on this ranch 14 years, and I've never seen anything like it. Nathaniel looked out at the yard, at the cleaned-up evidence of 200 people who had come and eaten and gone home carrying something with them that would translate over the next months into goodwill and investment and community standing that no bank board could easily move against. Neither have I, he said. She know that. I told her tonight. Clyde leaned back. Good. He paused. Was she gracious about it? She laughed at me. Clyde smiled. It was a rare enough thing that it changed his whole face. Good, he said again. That's good. They sat on the porch in the October evening, and inside the ranch house they could hear the sounds of the women finishing the kitchen. The particular warm domestic sounds that Nathaniel hadn't heard on this porch in 6 years, and Nathaniel thought about what he'd said to Margaret about managing. About the difference between keeping things running and being alive. He thought he understood it now. Not as a concept, as something he could feel in his chest, right there, present and specific and real. He was alive again. That was the thing she'd done. Not the supper, not the strategy, not the documents, or the loan, or the handling of Victoria Whitmore with bread and silence in a warm kitchen. Those were all real, and they all mattered. But underneath all of it, the thing she'd actually done was simpler and larger than any of it. She had walked into his life with one worn suitcase and the honest expectation of disappointment, and she had refused stubbornly daily, without fanfare, to disappear into the edges of his world the way everyone had assumed she would. She had made herself necessary, not by being irreplaceable, but by being present. Fully, genuinely, unperformatively present. And somewhere in the last 6 weeks, without deciding to, he had started organizing his days around the fact of her. "Clyde," he said. "Yeah. Tell the men tomorrow that the situation is resolved. They don't need details, but they've been carrying the tension of it, and they should know it's over." "I'll tell them." A pause. "Daniel's shoulder is healing." "I know. He told me." "He told you." Clyde looked at him. "He never tells anyone anything." Margaret sat with him while he did it. Clyde shook his head slowly. "She's something else, Nathaniel." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "She is." 3 days after the supper, a letter arrived from the bank. Not from the board, from the manager directly. Nathaniel read it at the kitchen table with his coffee, and when he finished, he set it down and sat with it for a moment. Margaret put eggs in front of him without being asked. "The loan terms," she said. "Renegotiated." He looked up. "Better terms than the original, actually." Crane apparently made a compelling case for the ranch's community, standing as a factor in its creditworthiness. She sat down across from him. "Is Whitmore?" "Resigned from the board," Nathaniel said. "Effective immediately. Health reasons officially." He paused. "The manager's letter mentions a review of certain board procedures. Diplomatic language for someone showed them something they needed to see." She nodded. "And Henderson," he said. "Transferred. Out of the territory." "Victoria," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't heard from the family." "I have," Margaret said. He waited. "She came to the kitchen this morning," Margaret said. "Before you were up. She stayed about 20 minutes. She picked up her coffee cup. She wanted to apologize for the way she looked at me when she came to call that first time. She said she knew what she was doing, and she'd told herself it was acceptable because—" Margaret paused. "Because women like her are taught that they're permitted to look at women like me that way, and she knows now that's wrong." "What did you say?" "I told her she could come to supper next Friday if she wanted to practice doing differently." He stared at her. "She's not a bad person," Margaret said. "She was given bad information and bad permission. That's not the same thing as bad character." She shrugged. "Besides, she handed us the documents. That deserves something." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're more generous than I am," he said. "No," she said. "I just have a different accounting system." He picked up his fork. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't keep score by what people have done to me," she said. "I keep score by who they're willing to become." She looked at him. "It served me better." He ate his eggs. He thought about 30 years of a woman who had been looked at and found lacking by every accounting system that valued the wrong things, who had developed her own accounting system out of necessity, and who had arrived in Wyoming with that system intact and proceeded to apply it to everyone she met. The young ranch hand who felt unseen, the foreman who worried about his boss, the damaged shoulder that needed rest, the bank plot that needed dismantling, the daughter of the enemy who needed a second chance. He thought, what kind of life leaves a person that generous and that clear-eyed at the same time? And the answer was a hard one. The answer was the kind of life that strips away everything that isn't necessary and leaves only what's true. "Margaret," he said. She looked up. "Thank you." he said. "For coming here." She was quiet for a moment. "You wrote back," she said. "I wrote the most honest letter I'd ever written in my life, and you wrote back. You didn't have to. I know I didn't have to." She looked at him with the steady, clear look that still, after 6 weeks, surprised him with its directness. "Then I should be the one thanking you," she said. He shook his head. "Let's call it even," he said. And for the first time since he had stood on a train platform, not knowing what to feel, Nathaniel Carter looked at his wife across a kitchen table and felt the specific, uncomplicated, slightly terrifying feeling of a man who has stopped managing his life and started living it. Outside the ranch was awake and moving 23 men going about the work of a property that was still standing, still running, still his. Inside the kitchen smelled of coffee and eggs and the particular warmth of a room where someone had been up before dawn caring about something. He sat at his own table and breathed it in. He thought, this is what belonging feels like. He had forgotten. He was glad to remember. The first snow came 3 weeks after the supper. Not the heavy snow of deep winter. The early snow. The kind that arrived in Wyoming like a warning light and fast and gone by afternoon, leaving the ground damp and the air carrying the particular cold clarity that meant everything was about to change. Nathaniel stood on the porch and watched it come in, and thought about the bank letter in his desk drawer, the one with the renegotiated terms, and about George Whitmore's name no longer appearing in the board correspondence that Crane had sent over last week, and about the north quarter of his land sitting exactly where it had always sat, unbothered and uncontested, and entirely his. He thought about all of it, and then he went inside to get coffee, and Margaret was already at the stove. She handed him a cup without turning around. "Snow," he said. "I know. I've been watching it. Early this year." 2 weeks early, she said. "I asked Clyde. He said it's been coming earlier every year for the past 4. She knew that because she'd asked. She asked everything. In 3 months, she had accumulated a working knowledge of this ranch that most men took 2 years to build. Not because she had exceptional intelligence, though she did, but because she was constitutionally incapable of accepting vagueness when specificity was available. She wanted to know the actual number, the real name, the genuine history. She wanted to know things the way they were, not the way they were easier to describe. He had come to understand that about her, the way you came to understand something that was always true, but took time to see. It was the same quality that had made her write that first letter the way she wrote it. She simply could not pretend. Not about herself, not about the land, not about the weather coming in 2 weeks early, not about anything that mattered. He sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee and watched her move around the kitchen. And he thought, I have been sitting at this table watching this woman work for 3 months, and it still surprises me. Not her competence, he'd known about that in the first week. What surprised him was that the watching never got ordinary. She never became furniture. She was always somehow specific. Present in a way that demanded you notice her without ever asking to be noticed. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "You." She turned, looked at him with the assessing directness that still after 3 months caught him slightly off balance. "What about me? That you're the most specific person I've ever known." She tilted her head. "What does that mean?" "It means..." He thought about how to say it. He was not a man who said things carelessly, and this was not a careful thing. This was real, and real things required more precision than careless things, not less. It means that you occupy the space you're in. You don't drift. You're always right there, right in the thing present in it. She was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor used to say I had no room in my head for anything that wasn't real," she said. She meant it as a criticism. She was right, Nathaniel said. It wasn't a criticism. The corner of her mouth moved. "No, I suppose it wasn't." She turned back to the stove. He watched the snow come down outside the window and dissolve before it hit the ground, and he thought, I almost didn't write back. And then he thought, I'm glad I did, with the full weight of someone who understands what the alternative would have been. Victoria Whitmore came to Friday supper for the 3rd time. It had become a quiet, unremarkable thing, her buggy appearing in the yard at 5 o'clock. Her knock at the kitchen door that was somehow both more tentative and more honest than the confident social entrance she'd made that first day months ago. She came and she sat at the table, and she ate, and she talked, and Margaret treated her with the same matter-of-fact directness she treated everyone, which meant she didn't perform forgiveness, and she didn't perform warmth. She didn't feel. She simply included Victoria in the conversation because Victoria had earned inclusion, and that was that. Nathaniel had asked Margaret once in the first week of this arrangement whether it was difficult. "Having her here," he said, "given how things started." "Not particularly," Margaret said. "She's different from how she was." "She's the same person." "People are never the same person," Margaret said. "They just look it from the outside." He had thought about that for several days. This Friday, Victoria came with a quietness about her that was different from her usual quietness, which was the quietness of a woman carefully rebuilding herself. This was something more specific. She sat at the table with her hands around her coffee cup and didn't speak much during supper, which everyone noticed and nobody addressed, because Margaret ran a table where people were allowed to be where they actually were, rather than where it was polite to be. Afterward, when the dishes were done, and Nathaniel had retreated to his study, and it was just the two women in the kitchen, Victoria said, "My father is leaving Wyoming." Margaret kept drying the dish she was drying. "Permanently." "He says temporarily. For his health." Victoria's voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone reporting facts they haven't finished feeling yet. The board asked him to step back, formally, with very diplomatic language about rest and recovery. "And you," Margaret said. "I stay." Victoria looked at her hands. "This is my home. Whatever he did, this is where I'm from." "That's a brave decision," Margaret said. "It doesn't feel brave. It feels—" Victoria stopped. "Like the only honest thing." Margaret set down the dish and looked at her. "You know what brave usually feels like." Victoria looked up. "Exactly like that," Margaret said. "Like the only honest thing." Something shifted in Victoria's face. Not relief, something quieter than relief, something that looked like a woman recognizing herself in a description she hadn't expected to fit. "How do you do that?" Victoria said. "Do what?" "Say the thing that's true, without armor, without building up to it." Margaret picked up the next dish. "Practice," she said simply, "and the understanding that the armor costs more than it protects." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "I told him I knew," she said. "My father, last week. I told him I knew what he'd done, and I told him I'd given you the documents." Margaret stopped. "What did he say?" she said. "That I'd betrayed my family." Victoria's jaw tightened. "I told him he'd betrayed his. First." She paused. "He didn't have an answer for that." Margaret set the last dish down and turned to face her fully. "Victoria, I know it doesn't fix anything. It fixes more than you think," Margaret said. "And you didn't need to tell him. You chose to. That's yours. That belongs to you." Victoria looked at her across the kitchen. "I owe you," she said. "You don't," Margaret said. "We're even." "We're not." "We are," Margaret said firmly. "You gave me the documents. I gave you bread. We're even." It was so direct, so unsentimental, and so completely genuine that Victoria laughed a surprised, real sound, and Margaret smiled, and the kitchen held them both for a moment, in the warm, uncomplicated way a good kitchen holds people when they've stopped pretending to be something other than what they are. When Victoria left, Nathaniel was standing in the hallway. He'd heard most of it. He looked at Margaret when she came out of the kitchen, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything about what had just happened because neither of them needed to. He took her hand as she passed him. She stopped. She looked at their hands, and then she looked at his face. "Come sit with me," he said. She came and sat with him. The letter from Iowa arrived on a Tuesday. It was from Margaret's brother, a man named Thomas Ellis, who farmed 40 acres outside of Ames and wrote letters in the careful, earnest handwriting of someone who had taught himself to read and write as an adult, and had never quite lost the self-consciousness of it. Margaret read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up, and when Nathaniel came down she was still holding it. "Thomas," she said before he could ask. "Good news or bad?" "Both." She set it on the table. "His eldest is sick. A long illness, they think. He needs—" She stopped. "He's asking if I can come back for a while." The kitchen was very quiet. Nathaniel sat down. He looked at the letter on the table between them. Then he looked at her face, which was doing the thing it did when she was holding something that hadn't settled yet. The careful stillness, the processing happening behind the eyes, the refusal to perform an emotion until she knew what she actually felt. "How long?" he said. "He doesn't know. A month, perhaps 2. He was quiet. "The ranch," she said. "The ranch will run," he said. "It ran before you came." "It ran," she agreed. "It didn't live," he said. She looked at him. "It will live," he said, "because you built something here that doesn't need you present every minute to keep running. You built people, Margaret. Those men know how to keep this place alive because you showed them what that looks like." He paused. "Go to your brother." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're certain?" "I'll miss you every day," he said. "I'm certain." That was the most direct thing he had ever said to her, and they both understood the weight of it, and she didn't minimize it or redirect it, or do any of the things she might have done 2 months ago when she was still waiting to discover the shape of what this was. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I'll write," she said. "Every day," he said. She almost smiled. "That's ambitious." "I'm a man of large ambitions." She did smile, then, fully the real one, the one he'd first heard in the kitchen and had been quietly organizing his days around ever since. "Every other day," she said. "Every other day," he agreed. She left on a Thursday morning, and the whole ranch came out to see her off, which had not been organized by anyone, and was simply what happened, because 23 men who had been fed and known and cared for by this woman needed to mark the moment of her absence. Daniel helped with her bag despite his shoulder, which was now mostly healed. Clyde stood by the wagon with his hat in his hands, which was something Nathaniel had never seen him do for any departure in 14 years. Pete, who was 19 and had been at the ranch 6 months now and had long since stopped looking like someone away from home for the first time, said, "You'll come back, won't you, Mrs. Carter?" "I will come back," Margaret said. "Take care of that coffee situation while I'm gone. You're making it too weak." Pete straightened. "I'll fix it." "I know you will." She climbed into the wagon. Nathaniel took the reins. They drove to the station in their usual silence, the companionable kind, the kind built out of 3 months of mornings and evenings and problems solved and things said and things understood without being said. He helped her with her bag. She stood on the platform. The train was 8 minutes away. "You know what I realized," she said. "Tell me." "That I came here expecting to be tolerated." She looked at him. "And then I thought maybe I'd be respected. And then—" She stopped. "And then," he said. "And then I stopped expecting things," she said. "Because what was actually happening was better than anything I would have known to expect." He looked at her on the platform, this plain woman from Iowa, who had arrived with one worn suitcase and an honest letter and the undefended expectation of disappointment, who had walked into his dead kitchen and made it alive, who had figured out the Whitmore scheme before he had the evidence, who had sat with Daniel while he found the words to ask for help, who had given Victoria Whitmore bread and a second chance, who wrote lists at 4 in the morning and said what she meant and kept the most precise accounting of human worth that Nathaniel had ever encountered. And he thought, "I am going to miss her with a specificity that is going to surprise me daily." He stepped forward. He kissed her. Not tentative, not performed. The way he did everything that actually mattered to him, which was fully and without reservation, because he was a man who, when he finally decided to do a thing, did it with his whole self. She kissed him back the same way. The train was 4 minutes away. "Come home soon," he said. "I will," she said. "Mind the kitchen while I'm gone." "I'll ruin it." "I know. That's why I left Ruth instructions." He laughed. Actually laughed the real thing, the sound of a man who has found his way back to something he thought he'd lost permanently. The train arrived. She got on. He stood on the platform until it was gone. So, she was away for 6 weeks. She wrote every other day exactly as promised, in the same small, careful handwriting she used for supply lists and planning documents, and the notes she left for the ranch hands. He read every letter twice. He wrote back every other day in the large scrawl that she had never once commented on, despite the fact that it bore no resemblance to legible penmanship. The letters were nothing like what he would have predicted 2 years ago that letters between himself and a wife would look like. They were not formal. They were not careful in the way of people performing intimacy. They were like their conversations, direct, honest, moving easily between the practical and the profound, without treating the shift as remarkable. She told him about Thomas's son, about the illness, about the particular slow terror of watching a child be sick when you could not make it fast, and you could not make it certain, and all you could do was be present and capable and keep the household running so that Thomas and his wife could focus on their boy. She told him what she cooked and why. She told him about the Iowa autumn, the specific flatness of it after Wyoming, and how the sky was different, lower, somehow less vast, and how she had not expected to miss the vastness, but she did. She told him she missed him, not as a performance. One sentence in the middle of a letter about Thomas's son, and the cost of the doctor, and the particular way the boy had started to turn a corner that week. One sentence, "I miss you," in the specific way I didn't know was possible before I understood what it meant to have someone to miss. And then she moved on to the next thing. He read that sentence 4 times. He wrote back, "The coffee is weak. Pete is working on it. And then I miss you in the same specific way. Come home when you're ready. The kitchen knows you're gone." She came home on a Thursday, which was the same day she'd left, which was the sort of detail that would have meant nothing before, and now meant something in the way that small things accumulated, meaning when you were paying attention to your own life instead of just managing it. He was waiting at the station. She stepped off the train, and he was there, and she stopped when she saw him, and she looked at him with the particular expression she had sometimes. The unguarded one, the one that didn't calculate. And he thought 6 weeks was not very long, and it felt like a very long time. "How's Thomas's boy?" he said. "Better," she said. "He'll be fine." "Good." He took her bag. "Hungry. Starving." Ruth left something on the stove. She fell into step beside him. "How's the kitchen?" "Functional." "That means it needs work." "I won't argue with that." They walked to the wagon in the easy, unhurried way of people who had stopped needing to fill every moment and had started just occupying them instead. And Nathaniel helped her up and took the reins, and they drove home through the Wyoming November with the cold, clean air around them and the road familiar and the ranch waiting at the end of it. "Tell me what happened while I was gone," she said. He told her. He told her about the new cattle assessment that had come back better than projected, and the bank manager's follow-up letter with the final renegotiated schedule that was by any measure more favorable than anything he'd had before. He told her about Pete's coffee, which was genuinely improving. He told her about Daniel, whose shoulder was fully healed, and who had quietly taken on a supervisory role with the newer hands that nobody had assigned him, and everyone had recognized as fitting exactly right. She listened. "Clyde," she said. "Clyde told me last week that he's never seen the men work with more sense of purpose," Nathaniel said. He said it without explaining why, because you know how Clyde is, but I understood what he meant. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not—" "Don't," he said. She stopped. "Don't tell me it's not you," he said. "Because it is. And you know it is." She looked at the road ahead of them. "It's both of us," she said finally. He considered that. "Yes," he said. "All right, it's both of us." She nodded, satisfied. That was the compromise she could accept, not the deflection, not the diminishment, but the accurate accounting. Both of them. Together. Which was, he thought, exactly what she had been trying to build from the first morning she woke up before dawn and started the fire. The thing that happened in December was not something either of them planned. It came out of an ordinary evening supper, finished the ranch quiet, the early Wyoming dark pressing against the windows, and it came out of a conversation that started as one thing and became another, the way the best conversations did. They were sitting in the kitchen. They did most of their important talking in the kitchen, which Nathaniel had stopped thinking was accidental. The kitchen was where she was most herself, and he had come to understand that he was most himself in whatever room she was most herself in. He had been thinking about something for 3 weeks, and he had been arranging it, and then rearranging it, and then deciding that arrangement was the wrong approach, and that he should simply say what was true, which was what she always did, and which was, he had come to understand, not the easiest way, but the cleanest. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up from the mending she was doing. Not from him. She gave him her full attention immediately, the way she always gave her full attention to things that mattered, without the performance of setting something aside to demonstrate that she was listening. She was simply listening. "You came here with one suitcase," he said. "I did. And you wrote a letter that said you weren't beautiful and you could cook. I remember the letter. And you came here expecting to be tolerated." He looked at her. "And you were not tolerated." She waited. "You were needed," he said. "And you were respected. And you were—" He stopped, found the word. "Wanted. Not for what you could manage, not for what you could cook, not for the supper or the scheme or the way you thought around corners that I couldn't see." He held her eyes. "You, Margaret Ellis Carter, the person, wanted." The kitchen was very quiet. "I know I'm not," he said. "I know the words don't come easily from me. I know I show things more than I say them, and I know that's not always enough, and I know you deserve to hear things said clearly." He leaned forward slightly. "So I'm saying it clearly. I love you. Not because of what you've done for this ranch, not because of what you saved, because of who you are when you're doing it. Because of the accounting system you use. Because of the way you gave Victoria Whitmore bread, when most people would have given her nothing. Because of the way you told Daniel you'd sit with him. Because of the way you said partner and meant it before I understood what the word was supposed to mean." She was very still. "I love you," he said. "And I should have said it sooner, and I'm saying it now." She looked at him for a long time. He watched her process it, the careful, precise intelligence doing what it always did, taking it seriously, giving it the respect of actual consideration rather than reaction. He had learned not to read that pause as hesitation. He had learned that the pause was the evidence that she was really hearing him, and that was worth more than a fast answer. "I came here," she said slowly, "and I told you I wasn't pretty." "You did. And you said, why would I be disappointed?" She tilted her head slightly. "I've thought about that moment many times since. What you meant by it. What did you decide? That you meant something I wasn't built to expect," she said. "That the terms I'd been using to evaluate my own worth weren't the terms you were using." She was quiet for a moment. "That takes a long time to believe. When you've spent your whole life being assessed a certain way." "I know," he said. "Take as long as you need." She looked at him. "I don't need more time," she said. "I've been—" She stopped, steadied something. "I've been there for a while. I was just making sure it was real before I said so." He felt something in his chest that had no good name, not just warmth, not just relief, something that was those things, and also the specific feeling of a man who has been handed back something he assumed was gone forever and is only now understanding what the loss had actually cost him. "Is it real?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It's very real." "Then say it," She looked at him with the direct, undeflected, completely unperformed honesty that was her most fundamental quality. The thing that had been in the letter, and in every conversation, and every morning, and every kitchen, and every difficult thing they'd done together. And she said, "I love you, Nathaniel Carter. I love you the way I love what's real," which means completely, and without reservation, and without any interest in pretending it's something other than what it is. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. They were married, really married, in the way that had nothing to do with paperwork, and everything to do with two people deciding to be each other's on a day. In late December, when the snow was real and the ranch was quiet, and Ruth and Clyde and Daniel and Pete were in the kitchen eating the supper Margaret had made, before she announced that she and Nathaniel were going to sit in the front room for a while, and they should help themselves to the rest. What happened in the front room was private. What came out of it was visible to everyone on the ranch the next morning, because what came out of it was the particular quality of two people who have finally stopped holding something back. And that quality showed in the way they moved through a room, and the way they looked at each other, and the way the ranch itself seemed to exhale as if it too had been waiting. Pete noticed it first. He said to Daniel at the breakfast table, "Something's different." Daniel looked at Nathaniel and Margaret at the other end of the table, and he said, "Yeah," and went back to his eggs. Clyde said nothing, but he smiled. Years later, the people of Wyoming Territory would tell the story of Nathaniel Carter and Margaret Ellis, the way communities tell the stories that matter to them, with the particular compression of time that legend requires, smoothing over the daily complexity and keeping the essential shape. They would say the richest rancher in the county married a plain woman from Iowa, and she saved his ranch, and he learned what beauty actually was. That version was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was this: a man who had been managing his life for 6 years instead of living. It received a letter from a woman who had spent her whole life being looked at and found lacking, and he wrote back 2 words: "Come here." Not because he was wise enough to know what he was inviting, but because something in her honesty had reached through the careful distance he kept between himself and everything that could hurt him, and touched something real. And she came. She came with one worn suitcase and the honest expectation of disappointment, and she found instead a man who listened. The way she listened completely without performance, with the full weight of his attention, and a kitchen that needed life breathed into it, and 23 men who needed someone to know their names, and a financial threat that needed to be outmaneuvered with community rather than capital, and a young woman who needed bread and a second chance. She found all of that, and she was exactly what all of that needed, because she had spent 30 years becoming precisely that person in contexts where it was never appreciated. And it turned out that the preparation was real, even when the appreciation was absent, and Wyoming needed everything she had. And Nathaniel Carter found a woman who did not want his money or his land or the social standing of his name, who came to his kitchen table at midnight when he had a bank letter he couldn't solve alone, who sat with him in supply rooms and wrote numbers in ledgers when she could see he needed company more than he needed help, who said partner before he understood the word and built everything around it. He found a woman who could not be managed, could not be kept at a comfortable distance, could not be reduced to what she cooked, or what she managed, or what she looked like. He found a woman who could not be made invisible. And that was the thing that the legend left out, that Margaret Ellis Carter had always been extraordinary. She had always been the most capable, most clear-eyed, most honestly human person in every room she'd ever stood in. The world had simply been looking in the wrong direction. Nathaniel Carter looked in the right direction. That was all he did, and it turned out to be enough. On a winter morning in Wyoming, years after the supper and the scheme and the letter and the train platform and all of it, Nathaniel Carter found his wife in the kitchen before dawn making bread in the dark, the way she always had, the way she had done since before he knew her name, and he stood in the doorway and watched her hands move through the familiar motions of a craft she had practiced her whole life. And she heard him, and she didn't turn, and she said, "Coffee's on." He poured 2 cups. He put one beside her on the counter. She reached for it without looking. Their hands touched in the dark briefly, the particular casual intimacy of two people who have stopped being careful with each other, and she went back to her bread, and he stood beside her and drank his coffee. And the ranch outside was waking up, the way it always woke up. The sound of men moving the particular creak of the barn. The low, distant voice of someone speaking to a horse. And the kitchen was warm, and it smelled of bread, and it was entirely, unmistakably, irreversibly alive. She had said once on a train platform in Wyoming in the voice of a woman preparing for disappointment, "I ain't pretty, Mr. Carter, but I can cook." And the rich rancher who had heard that and felt something crack open in his chest had spent the years since understanding what the crack had let in. Not beauty. Something that lasted longer than beauty. Something that built instead of decorated. Something that once found made every previous definition of valuable seem like a language learned in a country you would never return to. Margaret Ellis Carter was not plain. She had never been plain. She had simply been surrounded for 30 years by people who did not know how to read what they were looking at. Nathaniel Carter knew how to read it, and what he read every morning in that kitchen, every evening at that table, every night in the particular quiet of a house that had stopped being silent and started being still. The good kind of still, the kind that was full rather than empty, was the most valuable thing he had ever owned. Not the land, not the cattle, not the name or the wealth or the standing that the county accorded a man who had built an empire out of Wyoming dirt. A life. An actual inhabited, genuinely lived life built by two people who had told each other the truth from the very beginning and had never once stopped. That was the story of Nathaniel Carter and Margaret Ellis. And it was true from the first word to the last.